Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see all of you, and welcome to the IAFF Cancer Summit. I am honored to serve as the moderator for what we believe will be an incredible event, bringing together the leaders, the pioneers, and the innovative researchers in understanding cancer in the fire service. I also want to extend a welcome to those who are viewing this live through our webcast, both throughout the United States and Canada. Welcome. Throughout this summit, I will give brief introductions for each of our presenters. But I want to remind you that a more detailed bio can be found on the IAFF Frontline app. We have divided this summit into two segments. We will continue through the presentations this morning until our break at noon. For those here in the general session, we do have refreshments that are in the back room and available, and lunch will be provided by our sponsors in Colorado H. To begin, we will hear from the prime force behind this Cancer Summit. His illustrious career began as a rookie firefighter with the Fairfax County Fire Department in Virginia. The year was 1966. In his early years, donning SCBA was an option, seldom used, hidden on the rig, tucked away in a compartment inside a suitcase. Using it meant you were afraid to eat smoke. That was the equipment, and that was the culture. As he quickly advanced up the ranks, his career path took a different direction. Protections for firefighters, including fair wages, hours worked, and health and safety, were in the hands of those who made all the decisions. So he had to choose: continue up the management ladder or to be a voice through the labor movement. The risk was high, but he laid out a plan to create the first union for his department in a state where this could be the kiss of death for one's career. Fairfax County Professional Firefighters and Paramedics, Local 2068, exists today because he never backed down. That gutsy decision began a long journey. Today, he is considered among his peers as one of the strongest labor leaders in North America and a fierce champion for firefighters' health and safety. Among the many advances under his leadership is the significant expansion of the IAFF health and safety programs, including the Wellness Fitness Initiative, Candidate Physical Abilities Tests, Peer Fitness Trainer Certification, Fireground Survival, Behavioral Health Awareness and Peer Support Programs, and certainly not least, cancer presumption laws and innovative cancer awareness, prevention, and treatment initiatives, as well as, currently, the legislation in Congress to create the first cancer registry for firefighters. Please welcome a true trade unionist, your General President, Harold A. Shapeberger.
Thank you. Thank you. Pat, thank you. Thank you, brother. Thank you. Thank you, and good morning to everybody. Thank you very much. This ought to be interesting. This is my first opportunity to quasi-TED Talk. Usually I'm hanging onto a podium, for balance. I'd like to really get started, if I could, if we all would stand for a moment of silence. For those in our ranks over these years, including the 164 that will be placed on our hallowed walls in Colorado Springs this September, who lost their lives in the line of duty due to cancer. And I'd also like us to keep in our prayers the loss of one of our great champions on January 10th when we lost Dr. James Milius, who served as our chairman of our union's medical advisory board, who was worked so hard and involved in passing the Zadroga Act and in setting up the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. If we all could just a moment of thought and prayer. Thank you. I'd like to start by, first of all, thanking our sponsors. Tenkata, W.L. Gore, Globe, MSA, DuPont. They really came to the table and to provide everything we needed to put together this cancer summit, and covered virtually all the costs associated with it, including this morning's breakfast, today's lunch, and so much more. So please, everybody, appreciation for our sponsors for our first Cancer Summit. This union is really focused on so many health and safety policies. You heard a lot of them mentioned on Monday in my comments, but more importantly, you've learned about a lot of them over the course of this week, where we enjoyed just an incredible Alts and Human Relations Conference. And everything that we're trying to do with the scourge of cancer, with our members, is brought about the team I always talked about. It's led with my union partner, your GST, Ed Kelly, who has an extraordinary career as he's been coming through this labor movement of ours, and now serving as your GST. It comes about because of an executive board that's always focused on our members and on all of you, our leadership, and trying to do everything we possibly can to make sure that we are trying to reduce the experience of cancer and try to keep more names off those beautiful granite walls. So to our GST, Edzo Kelly, and our executive board, please give them a round of applause for everything they do for this union. And I also said Monday, that the officers get to establish the mission, establish the priorities, sometimes have an idea about some of the goals and programs, but it ultimately has to be produced into the services and tools and resources. And as it relates to our health and safety issues, we are blessed with an incredible staff led by Pat Morrison, who so graciously introduced me this morning, and from my home local, and Jim Brinkley, who's our Director of Health and Safety, Rick Swan, who's our Director in the Health and Safety Department for our focus on wildland firefighting, Larry Petrick, who's our Deputy Director of Health and Safety, an incredible health and safety staff. Every aspect of what we're trying to do to keep our members well, healthy, and living longer is due to their incredible work. So, gang, thank you very much for everything you're doing for this IAFF, wherever you are out here. I also mentioned Monday, and Bobby Halton and I had a chance to do a little interview yesterday to talk about cancer. And the two of us coming from the same generation, we talked about the old superhuman firefighter. And how, eating smoke was a badge of courage. And coming out from that hallway and, excuse me, blowing a black snot out of your nose was just, if you didn't have that going for you, then you weren't really doing much of a job on the job. And unfortunately, more than not, including myself, thank God I quit 45 years ago, first thing you do when you'd walk out of a job is you'd light up a cigarette. That was the image of firefighting. And we've got to change that image, and we've got to change that culture, and that's what we're doing. And so much has changed over time. We've made a lot of advancements and making sure, you keep that SCBA on, keep that mask on. Yeah, even during an overhaul. We're going to be learning, a lot about new protocols and techniques and trainings over the course of today. And all of this, again, is dedicated toward our members living. I don't want to be dramatic, but they're dying, and they're dying younger and younger from cancers. And we can do something to help stop that. As I said, to keep those beautiful walls with less and less of our members' names on them. So that's what part of today is about, to send you home, with the new prevention and education techniques, to really understand the true risk of cancer that our members are subjected to. To make sure that we're wearing our proper gear and we're deconning at the scene and we're washing off your body and turnouts after the job. We're going to learn so much more about the early detection today. Pat mentioned our Wellness Fitness Initiative. That was not just to keep our people healthy, but those were the early medical requirements so we can start catching cancers and other occupational diseases much, much earlier, give a chance for better treatment and better results from treatment. We're going to require annual medicals, and that's what we began to do, and make sure that our members know that we want them fit and to have good nutrition. And then to build a peer trainer program to help them make sure that they could stay fit and work out in a very productive way. And now 8,000 certified physical fitness trainers that we've provided and established over the course of these several years. So whether it's bagging up your gear, which is going to be a lot of resistance to that, and there's a lot of departments where, hey, that's a great idea, but we get 3 jobs a shift. But it is a goal to pursue, and making sure that we are using the extractors to clean them up as quickly as possible, demanding from our departments, 2 sets of gears, because so many have simply one. We're going to be talking today about policies, taking on the chemical industries, as I mentioned, to try to force them to reduce the amount of flame retardants that they're stuffing in all of our furnishings and all of our flooring and wall coverings. We're going to be talking about the NFPA and OSHA standards that protect our firefighters and how we're continuously enhancing those standards and trying to make them stronger and more effective. We're going to be talking about the presumptive laws that our affiliates and our state and provincial bodies have been doing incredible work in establishing, through law, through the political process, to make sure that cancer is an occupational occurrence, and unfortunately disease. And when disabled, should be entitled to the benefits. And unfortunately, when fallen, to make sure our families get the right benefits that any other occupational disability or death would be entitled to. We're going to be talking about how we can keep adding the cancers to those laws and enhance picking up more and more of our people to be covered by them. You're going to be hearing more about N4s, and yes, it's data, and yes, for some of us, it's like, my gosh, it's so not hard to understand, but we've got to understand how critically important our N4s program will be to exposure and making sure that our members are recording their exposure so that we can follow them through their careers. We're going to be hearing about groundbreaking studies. You're going to be hearing about the dust studies where it's been documented now, that chemicals, toxins that we're bringing back into the firehouse and we're bringing home to our families is real. And then we'll talk about the protocols and SOPs to limit that cross-contamination. We'll be also talking about the fluorescent aerosol screening test and demonstrating how the particles get through our PPE still and it gets absorbed in our skin. All of this, again, to lead to better outcomes. And then we're going to continue to make sure that our cancer registry bill, H.R. 931 and S. 382, will finally get through the Congress and to the President's desk for signature so that we have another basis of data and research and experience that will help the scientific community and the medical community understand how better to protect our members from these horrible diseases. And you're going to be learning about groundbreaking diagnostic tools that leads to groundbreaking treatment. When unfortunately, if our members, get cancer, you'll be hearing about the GPS cancer from Nant Health and the unbelievable use of supercomputers and how they can now diagnose cancer to personalize it for you, your cancer, and provide such a very specific treatment that leads to much better outcomes. We got a great lineup of speakers. So please, just listen carefully. I know you will. Take this information home. Take it back to your departments. Work with command and management to help institute a lot of what you'll be taught today. And I think that together then we're going to bend that unfortunate curve and make sure that we continue to improve the health and safety of our members. So enough from me. Let's really get started. This is a day of information and education and instruction. And so I'm simply going to turn it back over, Pat, to you. Have a great day. I'm looking forward to listening to every single speaker myself. Thanks.
Thanks, boss. Thank you. Thank you for those words. Many of us gathered today know the pain of watching a fellow firefighter struggle and lose a battle to occupational cancer. I don't think there's anybody in the room that doesn't know another firefighter or somebody in your life that has had that battle, leaving behind friends and families to cope with the loss. I also know we have today with us firefighters who beat the odds after a cancer diagnosis. And I know we have firefighters out there that you're battling today, and you might be with us. But as the numbers of cancer deaths continue to climb among our ranks, this summit is your call to action and why we are here today. We have brought together some of the very best subject matter experts, as the General President stated, to share their understanding, analysis, and information on topics presented at this summit, so that we can make a difference in reducing this scourge, but not only if we have the courage. We need the courage to make the difference, and we have to make the difference. I want to just start with one disclaimer that we have. I want to remind that each speaker is responsible for his or her own content. The Cancer Summit sponsors assume no liability whatsoever for the accuracy or completeness of this information provided and make no claims or warranties of any kind as to the prevention, reduction, or cure of any health condition, including cancer. Sounds like I'm doing a prescription ad on TV right now, so. Maybe that's about what I say. So, but really what I want to start with this morning is I'm going to do a summary of firefighter cancer cohort studies. I really want to take a look at just an overview of the studies that we've had, that we've known, some of the bigger studies that have taken place on that. Can you guys go ahead and, let me just go ahead and get the next slide here. Cancer, let me just start with, cancer is the leading cause of death in the United States. It's not the first, it's the second, after heart disease. Cancer takes years to develop, and we know that. And that, for us, when a cancerous cell, or the cancer gets into that cell, it can take up to 40 years before it manifests. And for firefighters, for us, that is extremely important because we have a long latency period for some of the cancers. And when we have that, there's multiple factors. There's multiple factors that you come with, that you're born with, that, some of those things that you can control, smoking, diet. And then there are those environmental factors, the factors that we have every day that we are faced with. Connecting exposure to cancer. So how do we go about that? That's probably the number one issue. Anytime we have a presumption law, we have to go ahead and try to testify, and we do testify, and let those people know that this cancer is coming from our occupation. One area, we're going to have another individual that's going to really delve into this, but it's the International Agency on Research on Cancer, better known as IARC. And it really does look at, these are people that get together and they look at chemicals out there in the world and say, what is the relationship between those chemicals and cancer? And they do that for the general population. We are rolled into that population, but they do that. If it's a group 1, we know that it's a carcinogen. If we know that chemical is a carcinogen, and we know that we're exposed to that carcinogen, we know that we have a relationship there with that. Relevant approaches. You're going to hear, we have some great researchers here. They're going to go over some of the studies here. But a couple of the studies that have taken place, and what we do know, is that animal exposure studies are probably the best that can keep everything the same. That we can do the studies on animals, we can expose them to those chemicals, and then we can study them. That gives us somewhat of a control. But we do know that, humans aren't rodents, although that could be debated in here. But we do know that we need epidemiology studies. We know that we need other studies of firefighters out there right now that we are looking at as a cohort, a group of firefighters that we can watch, that we can track, that we can study over time. And that's that cohort study. You're going to hear a lot about that today on a new research taking place and the NIAFF study. Because we really want those similar exposures that firefighters have. And we want to make sure that when we do study firefighters in that cohort group, that we can actually do some case studies we have a group of firefighters that have cancer, and then we can actually look at the population, the general population, and then overlay that with the same age, the same demographics, and saying what are the cancer rates in that population versus what are the cancer rates within the fire service. Some of the biggest studies that we have are called meta-analysis. What's a meta-analysis? What it is, it's taking a group of studies and putting it together. What's the strength of that? The strength of that is, and the problem that we have in the fire service, is that we don't have a high N. We call that the number. Sometimes we don't have women in the fire service or underrepresented. So when we're looking at breast cancer, how many women do we have out there to study? And it's difficult. So if we have individual studies that have some women in those studies and we can combine those, it gives us a strength to make a better definition and definitely a scientific correlation between that cancer and firefighting. So Grace LeMasters really took 32 studies for firefighters, and we're going to have her list here, but she did that and put those together, and you can see that 10 types of cancer that she studied definitely were significantly increased for firefighters. And we had another 10, these are 20 cancers, we had another 10 that were increased, but what we call not significant. NIAFF's firefighter cancer study. This is the big daddy, and it's not over. We're still looking at this group, and we're going to be following this group, and you're going to have somebody else talking about this. But it's one of the largest studies in the U.S. on firefighters. 30,000 career firefighters, Chicago, Philly, and San Francisco. 60 years of somebody's life, where we looked from 1950 to 2009. And it was the first study that we could have a group of those underrepresented in here because it was so large, the 30,000 population. And you got to take, this study really took a look at two things that really helped us out. The researchers and the principal investigators went back and looked at death certificates and tumor registries. So we're able to go back and take a look at those and add those into the study. We compared those deaths, those diagnoses in the firefighters to the general public. And that's what I had mentioned before on the previous slide. And we tried to control for the age, the sex, the race, and the calendar time. You really want to look at, if you're looking at somebody in the 50s, you have to be very careful about comparing them to somebody in today because of the treatment and some of the cancers that have decreased that were killing us earlier, but we've gotten ahead with the treatment protocols. So the result was we had in that group, in that 30,000, we had 4,461 diagnoses, and we had 3,285 deaths. We had increase in cancer rates overall, both in death and diagnosis. And we had some significant increases for certain cancers that you can see up there. So I kind of want to go through this a little bit, that I want to kind of say, what did the NIASH study tell us? It was just one study. It was a robust study. It was big, and it brought a lot of information. But what did it actually tell us? We know that every year that we put firefighters on our Fallen Firefighter Memorial, we have a very, very high percentage of those going on the wall. We had almost, out of 249 that we put, 161 are on the wall, that will be on the wall this year in September from occupational cancer. But that's 68, and that's really over 60% every year that we're doing that. That's not the cancer rate that I want to talk about here. What I want to talk about here is that what we have in the general population, this is really what you need to know, from the NIASH study, we are 14% increase than the general population for cancers. 14%. So you know that. You have those numbers. We already know, even starting off the gates, that this is what we have. And we do know that we have a 9% higher risk in cancer diagnosis. The Firefighter Cancer Support Network that we work with, and they're still here, they have a booth out there, they have a lot of good information for you to go back and take a look at that. So I really ask you to take a look at their website. NIASH had two parts. First part, we had to go and find how many firefighters died from cancer. We had to find out how many were diagnosed. We had to look at that. The second part of the study was very, very difficult. But the second part is probably the most, the part that you will be interested in the most, because what they had to do is they had to go back, look at those deaths, look at those diagnoses, and then match those with exposure. So you have firefighters out there, and they're going to go back. Now we've got the cancers, we've got the 14% increase, the 9% in diagnosis, we have the numbers. We want to go back now and look at that firefighter. How many runs did that firefighter do? How many calls did they run? How long were they on the fire ground? And how long over a period of time were they firefighters throughout their career? And that really gives you a true indicator of what we're trying to get. And with that, they had lung cancer, you can see, and leukemia risk with that exposure. Those were the two that really that came out. Colon and prostate cancer, this risk here, and you're going to hear me, there's going to be a lot of studies, that was decreased in some of the older population. And what the general president said, and what we're really concerned with, is prostate cancer. We are getting prostate cancer at a higher level at a younger age. Those are when the bells and the lights went off and said that we have to really take a look at this. And that you take a look at this study, and it will spotlight that. And I'll be going over a couple other studies that will kind of bring out what I consider prostate cancer as one of the #1 cancers that we need protection to and more research on. The Nordic study was another study. It was kind of half of what the NIASH study was, but it really looked at sort of the same parameters, the same group, the same measurement. And I just kind of want to go through a couple of things there that they had an increase. And we had the melanoma, the non-melanoma. We know those are increased, the skin cancer, lung cancer, and then they had an increase in prostate cancer. That's the Nordic study increase. Here's the one that both the Nordic and the NIASH that we've missed. And we've missed it. Everybody here in the room has missed it. It's mesothelioma. And we do know there's one cancer that I can tell you right now that causes mesothelioma, one particle, and that's asbestos. Asbestos fiber. Sometimes it only takes one fiber in your lung to do that. It can take 40 years for it to manifest. So if it takes that long, going back to those death certificates that we did, that's when we started picking up. Twice the amount in the NIASH study. But we're retired, we're gone, and we've left the job, and we don't even have the protection for that. And this is something we're going to look at. And this is the one that surprised us. It surprised all of us. The Nordic did it, and we had the NIASH study did it too. What they said they didn't observe was a change in prostate cancer risk after screening started. So you would imagine that we have the World Fitness Initiative. And one of the biggest things there is the baselines, the medicals, and cancer screening. So you would imagine that if we had these screenings, and we're getting those screenings out there, that we would see a decrease in the prostate that we're getting, and that's not what we're seeing right now. So we're still seeing that increase in prostate cancer. The Australian study is another interesting one. It was 17,000 full-time firefighters, and they had a volunteer cohort in this group also. And some of the things that they brought out in their study, and things that we want to talk about here, is that there was a less risk of lung cancer. And they really attributed that, the researchers, to less smoking. But they had the increase kidney, prostate, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Prostate cancer, again, associated with increased attendance at fires. So again, when I say it was an increased attendance at fires, we go back to the exposures. How many exposures did you have? How many fires did you have? And why it is so important that we have to limit those exposures. I mean, from day one, I think most of us are overexposed at that training academy. I don't know how many went to the training academy, and they would have pit fires, and they would have chemicals being burned, and we were just swallowing all the, from day one, we were getting a dose that we shouldn't have been getting, and that is changing. The one I want to pick out here, the melanoma that we are seeing in firefighters, and the Australian study, we would say, well, it's real sunny out there. They're gonna have a higher melanoma. But what we associated the melanoma in the Australian study was longer service. Again, longer time. The more you're on the job, you're going to get the melanoma. But the thing here is the sunniest places in Australia had the lower melanoma. So it wasn't about just that sun exposure. It was about the other exposures from the job. We have other studies that we're looking at, we're putting in. You'll see it. We have several studies in here, the California Cancer Registry study, a lot. We keep looking at this. At the IAFF, we're looking at all these studies, trying to get information and changing. We have to move forward and change with the new information that we have. You might be hearing a lot from the UK. This is the Institute of Medicine out there. They're doing a meta-analysis. It just came out. What we're always very, very careful with is that this still has to be peer-reviewed. We have to look at this. We're going to consider this very, very closely. Dr. Virginia Weaver, who works with us at from Johns Hopkins University, is sort of one of our lead there at the IAFF to kind of go through these studies and guide us through what is actually that we can use and what do we have to wait for to get additional information. Here's just a list. So I went through a lot of studies. I went through them fairly fast, and you have this list. You have a down there, and you'll see where the check marks are. And those are the significant cancers that those studies have spotlighted. And if you look at that, and the asterisk there, just to let you know what the asterisk is, that's like an age-specific cancer that they have recognized. So if you look at that, and let's just go down to prostate, you can see from the masters, age-specific in NIOSH, the Nordic, the Australian, and California. That's the one. You can see some of those others that we're looking at. We really take a look at this list. There's 10 cancers here that when we go and testify anywhere in the US or Canada, that we can go in there with the information, with the science, and tell those legislators that these are the cancers that are killing firefighters. These are the cancers that we have to have protection. And just remember, no information is stagnant. No studies are stagnant. We're going to continue to add information in to make sure that we're getting the best information to the firefighters. Challenges for our studies in the firefighter population is exposure miscalculation. The healthy worker effect. I'll spend just a minute on this. What is the healthy worker effect? So if you're a researcher, you're going to study cancer. You're going to study cancer in the general population. You want the old, you want the young, you want the healthy, you want the sick, but you want them all in that population when you're studying it, because that's the slice of the population that you need to get the information. For firefighters, if you look at our group, and if you were to do the same thing and say, we're going to study a cohort of firefighters just in one group, we have to take into account that we are healthier than the general population. If we have a reduced risk in some of these cancers, but if you look at our healthy population, we have to add back in that we are firefighters, we are more physically fit. We have additional screening responsibilities. We have this candidate physical abilities test that you have to take. So our population, and you start squeezing it together, is extremely healthy. So we always have to take a look at that for adjusting those studies. This one here is just, we have to make sure that some of the data that we have, did we have all the data? Did we have the history? Did we have the diet? Did we have the weight? Do we have other exposures? We can't kid ourselves. We can't kid ourselves and say that there are other factors, that can contribute to this along with our exposures. And we really have to take a look. So, significant size of effect. size here is that, tobacco smoke. If you take tobacco smoke right now, what that's saying right there is that if you're living with someone who's smoking cigarettes, you have 1.25 chance of getting cancer just from the secondary smoke. Move that out to what we do. We have secondary smoke on every single call that we run with fire. There is some good news. There's been a drop in death for the general population. We have fewer, 26% from 1991. That's great because of the treatment and what we're seeing, that we can get ahead of the cancers and save lives. So we have a reduction. It still remains the second leading cause of death with over 600,000 deaths for the general population. And this is the one that scares me the most. This is the one sometimes I don't understand it. I got to delve into it. I have to ask the people that really understand it. Is that when you start to see a chart that says the general population of cancers are starting to go down, but then you start to see a rise in the firefighter population in certain areas going up, that's when we know we have a significant problem. We got to talk about it. These are things that we have to do. The general president said the Wellness Fitness Initiative. And when we started that in 1996 and 97, when we were really down, and the general president chaired that group, we said one of the first things we said, we have to have firefighters stop smoking. We had to have them to quit smoking. We said, let's get policies in there and say that if you're going to hire fire, maybe you have to grandfather it in. But we said that would be one of the #1 areas that we could start to reduce cancers. And that was really, really important for us to put that in there. But we have those things that we do know that these decreases. We're starting to see a decrease in cigarette smoking. The only thing that we're worried about the firefighters with cigarette smoking is now they're doing smokeless tobacco. And we're starting to see an increase in some other cancers. So we really have to take a look. When you look at cancer, you're coming in, and we know the risks are high to do the job that we do. Can you counter those risks? Can you put those fitness programs together? Can you put an annual, if you don't have an annual medical in your fire department, you've got to go back and have those baselines. You have to have that on a yearly basis. The only way that we can catch this cancers early is with those early screenings. But you have these other elements that you have to put in there on this, and we have to do that. We know that the second leading cause right now in cancer in the general population they're contributing is obesity. We have to start taking a look at this and putting this into play. We've selected other types of risk factors. You see that some of the cancers that come from this, we know that this is here from obesity, alcohol, and smokeless tobacco. Those are the cancers that are coming from that exposure. Unvalidated cancer screening tests. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we are really concerned. We have a lot of people out there saying this is the latest screening panel that I have. This is the latest screening that is going to find cancers in your whole population. We take this very, very serious. We make sure that we don't just take somebody's test and say that that's what we're going to do, screening tests. We are looking at these, and sometimes we have to put out paper that we do not have enough evidence that this is actually taking place. So I know we have a lot of people out there that have this. Well, we have position papers on this, but we're going to continue to look at this and make sure that we're researching this. So if someone is getting a screening, it's for the right reason. It's not just that somebody wants to make an awful lot of money screening every firefighter for certain things. We want to make sure we're doing it for the right reason. We do recommend that we reduce the occupational exposure, the non-occupational exposures. I've talked about that. We talked about the Wellness Fitness Initiative. Cancer screening tests are built into that. NFPA 1500 has it in there. And I really, really challenge you, take the cancer awareness course on our site. It's an online course. Sometimes you think you have all the information. Sometimes you know it. Go back, put it out, make sure it's a membership. Tell the department, let's just do this as an in-service drill. You really need to do that. All right. That is just an overview. What's going to follow up with my presentation are going to be some other studies that are really going to take place that are absolutely going to not only support what I've just stated, but you're going to hear some very innovative and what's going on in the future and what are we studying into the future. As the General President acknowledged, our sponsors have played a key role in making this summit a reality, and we appreciate their support. And to introduce our next segment, we're going to start doing that, what we laid out in here, these segments on today, this morning, and this afternoon. To introduce this segment on the latest research on cancer, I would like to introduce Jennifer Wise of W.L. Gore and Associates, one of our sponsors for this event. Jennifer joined W.L. Gore Associates in 2000 as an industrial and chemical systems engineer in the fabrics division. She has worked performing different functions at Gore, including manufacturing leaderships, technical, and sales. Jennifer found her home when she joined the fire and public safety business in 2005, focusing on chem bio products for law enforcement, fire, and chem bio agencies. Jennifer has great enthusiasm for driving product change and solutions that have positive and meaningful effect on firefighter safety and effectiveness. Before Jennifer comes to the stage, please turn your attention to the video screens.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Jennifer Wise, and getting to this point has been really exciting and fun. This is a really important topic, but what's great about it is we've gotten here today, and it's been fun working with the IAFF, and I can't thank them enough. General President Shapeberger and your staff, and all of the locals that we've got to interact with has been fun in doing this challenging work and bringing some important information to all of you. I represent hundreds of people back at Gore that dedicate their careers to trying to build better and safer products for the fire service. And that's something that we take great pride in. I also want to thank the partners we have here, Tenkata, Globe, and DuPont, for helping us put this all together. We can't do this without them, and we can't work in the fire service every day without their help and support. For over 60 years, Gore has built a reputation for being able to deal in complex and challenging environments and deliver products that improve lives. Everything from developing systems for NASA to put rover on Mars, to implantable medical devices. In the fire service, what we've brought is some of the most exciting changes. We were the company that came into the very first fire department and said, you wear something that's hot and heavy, and we have a product called Gore-Tex, and we'd like you to try it. And it's gonna be breathable, and it's still gonna protect you from water coming in from the outside. And we continue to innovate today, and we're dedicated to trying to work through these issues and bring more of the improvements in the future. Some of the recent things that we've focused on is being able to bring particulate blocking layer into particulate blocking hoods, and we're proud to be the first hood that was certified to the new category of particulate blocking hoods in the 2018 edition of the standard. While we did bring some great breathability decades ago to the fire service, we are gonna continue with that and continue with working with firefighters, monitoring and figuring out how we can continue to lower body core temperatures with the technologies we bring, because now more than ever, it is critical that you wear and don your gear properly. And that means that breathability is gonna become even more critical. When I thought about coming up here and what I was gonna talk about today, I knew that I wasn't gonna be able to tell you guys anything about firefighting, so I wanted to leave you with a couple of things that I learned working at a really great organization. One was the belief in the individual, and two is making your own commitments. And we're not going to be able to do this unless everybody in this room makes a commitment after what you've learned today. So I'd like you to take one of the sheets in front of you and flip it around and write my commitment. And I'm really hoping that at the end of the day, each and every one of you has made some notes on there, and you're gonna leave here with what you've learned and the commitment you're making to help make this change for the future. Thank you, and enjoy all of the great talks that you're about to go through today.
Good job. Nice job. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer and W.L. Gore, for all of your support for this Cancer Summit. No one can deny that what we learned from the NIAR study, especially due to the sheer number of firefighters included in that study, which gave us empirical evidence to back up what we have been saying all along about the prevalence of cancer among firefighters. Our next presenter will discuss what's being done with that data now. He will also discuss what we continue to learn about the exposures that occurred on 9/11 and many months that followed. Dr. Brazan is the Chief Medical Officer for the Fire Department of the City of New York, or as everyone says, FDNY, and the Special Advisor to the Fire Commissioner for Health Policy. Dr. Brazan serves on the National Academy's Institute of Medicine Committee on Personal Protective Equipment. He's a member of the IAFF Redmond Advisory Board and an original member of the WFI Technical Committee representing FDNY, and serves on the NFPA Technical Committee on Health and Safety. Dr. Brazan was at the World Trade Center taking care of FDNY firefighters and EMS rescue workers when the buildings collapsed. Since then, he has been responsible for design and implementation of a medical monitoring and treatment program for FDNY firefighters and EMS World Trade Center rescue workers. And he is continuing with the NIOSH research on firefighter cancer as compared to the general population. He has been influential in all areas of firefighter health and safety. Please welcome Dr. David Brazan.
Thank you all. It's a true honor to be here today to talk about what we're doing at FDNY and what we're doing with the entire fire service. None of this would be possible without your support, and I'm going to be demonstrating that to you as we move forward here in this presentation. What I'm talking about here is combined power, the power of everyone out there to make a difference. And where we're starting is by continuing the great work that you've already heard being done by NIOSH in their 3-city cancer study, and adding the FDNY cancer study to that. All right. Now, we all know that firefighting is going to cause cancer, but why is it plausible? It's plausible because at fires, we're exposed to all of these carcinogens: aromatic amines, metals, fibers, petrochemicals, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, dioxins, PCBs, reactive oxygen compounds, solvents. All of this is at every fire. And that's the basics for the bioplausibility that firefighting exposure is related to cancer. All right? We're building on basic science knowledge. And that led to the NIOSH study that you just heard about, where they went and they took 3 cities with a tremendous cooperation from management and labor to get all of these firefighters that had been working there since 1950 forward, ending the study in 2009, to put together the amount of numbers necessary for the first time to demonstrate in a fantastically scientifically designed study that firefighting can cause cancer. All of the other studies that you heard about were really studies that led to this study. This is the critical study. And here you can see that colon cancer, kidney cancer, lung cancer, mesothelioma, NHL, which stands for lymphoma, prostate, rectal, stomach cancer, were found to be increased. Some of these increased for the entire group, others of them increased for age-specific subgroups of firefighters in 3 urban centers: San Francisco, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Now, NIOSH used roster information to put all this together, like I said, with cooperation from labor and management. But that study ended in 2009. Huge amount of effort going into that study, huge buy-in by all of you. But unfortunately, as the federal government does things, they had no funding to continue this study. Worse than that, their agreements with the 3 cities was that if they were to lose funding, all of the data would be destroyed to maintain confidentiality. We went to NIOSH through the World Trade Center Health Program, through the funding that many of you have helped us get through the Zadroga Act, and we said to them, this study can't die. We have to figure out a way to use Zadroga dollars to keep this study going. And we came up with a very novel approach. We said, the way we can make this study World Trade Center related and keep it going is to consider these 3 cities as a control group for the FDNY World Trade Center Health Program cancer study. In other words, when we see that cancer is increased in FDNY World Trade Center firefighters and EMS workers, we don't know whether that's just the World Trade Center or firefighting plus the World Trade Center. We compare to the general population, it doesn't tell us that. But now we're going to be able to compare to these 3 cities, and it will be able to separate out firefighting and World Trade Center. So we'll be able to hopefully tell you which of these exposures are causing cancer and the cumulative synergistic effect between firefighting and World Trade Center exposure. This is going to be huge, huge benefit. But what it also allows us to do is to keep these 3-city study going on forward. So we'll have data and results that you will get for each of these cities, for the 3 cities combined, and for the 4 cities with FDNY. And we are going to be able to continue this, and the data was not destroyed. We've worked for the last year since getting this funding in getting all the legal arrangements necessary so that we could receive this data. And I'm happy to say that just a few weeks ago, we received the final set of data from Philadelphia. We already had San Francisco and Chicago, and just a few weeks ago, in mid-December, we wound up getting the Philadelphia data as well. So now we are poised to really start this study. What we don't have is the data from 2009 forward, because the study ended. That's what we're going to be doing. And part of that is to find out, is to update all of the cancers that have occurred since then, and also the deaths that have occurred since then. We have a steering committee where the IAFF is going to have a member. Each of the 3 cities is going to have a labor and management member, and there'll be membership from FDNY and our World Trade Center Analytic Group. This will lead to complete, total transparency, and it will allow us to do an additional thing that the NIOSH study didn't do. We're not going to just use this data, this roster information for cancer. We're going to use it to actually call all the members, to actually link them up with a website, and try to get data on other diseases that are of interest to the fire service. Is emphysema increased? Is asthma increased? All of these other diseases as well. So we're truly going to be expanding this study. All right. Now, here's a critical thing to understand. There's about 30,000 firefighters in the 3-city study, and I'll show you later with FDNY we're able to add another 10 to 20,000. But of these 30,000, enrollment ended in 2009. So what we have is we don't have enough power to look at everything. We don't have enough numbers to look at everything. For example, There's only 1,000 females in this study as of 2009. In addition, as you can see here, all right, many of these people, about 8,000 of them, were hired before 1950. What does that mean? Well, let's look at this. If we were to project out their age as of today, we would see that about 12,000 of the 30,000 are above the age of 80. That means that likely a good percentage of those are unfortunately have died, which means that we will have data of why they died and data up to their date of death, but our study will rapidly decrease in numbers from 30,000 to about 18,000. Right? Looking at this, so with that, we need to enroll more people. So another aspect of this study, once we start meeting with the steering committee, is trying to get newly hired firefighters as well. And that newly hired firefighters since 2009 will not only allow us to increase the numbers so that we can have the power to find out about cancer and hopefully other diseases, but it also will allow us to look at firefighters who have exposures to some of these modern building fires. Right? If you look at the data up to 2009, you can see that only about 3,000 to 4,000 were hired after 2000. We want to increase that number substantially. So we're going to add FDNY to the 3 cities. We're going to have greater power. We're going to be able to distinguish World Trade Center from firefighting. We're going to add other diseases of concern. And what we found at the World Trade Center, and what we published for the first in 2011, and have had many publications since then, is that World Trade Center did increase cancer in our firefighters and EMS workers. And we were the first to show that. And it's only because of this study that the Zadroga Act added cancer. Prior to this study coming out in 2011, cancer was not covered in either the Zadroga Act, the World Trade Center Health Program, or the Victims' Compensation Funding. So FDNY is very sad that we have this increase in cancer, but very proud that we were able to fulfill our commitment to each and every one of you, that we would be transparent, that we would publish the truth, and that we would use the truth to advocate in a data-driven manner to get every one of you the protection and health care that you deserve. Now at FDNY, when someone comes down with cancer, their cancer is completely covered, not just as a pension disability benefit through presumption, but also their treatment is completely covered. I had a firefighter who came to me just a while ago, and he said that he'd come down with throat cancer, and it was really bad. And he was speaking to his doctor in one of the private health programs that his health insurance pays for. And he had signed up for this program to keep his costs down. And the doctor said to him, well, you know, we have an oncologist here that can treat this cancer. He doesn't have that much experience with this type of cancer, but we're going to set you up with an appointment for him. And we're going to get you that appointment in 3 weeks. He said to the doctor, I might be dead in 3 weeks. He said, well, this is the best we can do. He said, well, I live in New York City. What about getting me into Sloan Kettering? And the doctor said, the program doesn't cover Sloan Kettering, this private health insurance program. So he went home and he's waiting for 3 weeks for an appointment with this doctor. And he's speaking to a friend, and the friend says, what are you, an idiot? Call up FDNY. You're covered in the World Trade Center Health Program. And he said, I thought cancer wasn't covered. And he said, no. This is all changed. Cancer's covered. Call up FDNY. Call up the World Trade Center Health Program. So we got a call from him. We got him an appointment to Sloan Kettering in 2 days. His entire treatment is covered. He's getting experimental chemotherapy at 0 cost to him and his family. No deductible, no copay, no nothing. The fire department has volunteers that drive him to Sloan Kettering 3 times a week for him to get his chemotherapy, so he doesn't have to be vomiting on the way home in the train. This is all part of what you guys have allowed us to give back to you guys. He's alive. So we're going to add our 10,000 people to this, and we're going to keep on doing this study. What we've already shown in these 10,000 is that 10,000 with 85% being at the World Trade Center day 1 or day 2, so huge exposures. What we've already shown is that cancer is increased. And this increase can be looked at in a variety of different ways. One, the most conservative way, and we had to show conservative as well as liberal analyses to NIOSH to get this covered. But the most conservative way is that there's a 10% increase compared to the general population. That means that firefighting plus World Trade Center exposure increased cancer by 10%. That means that for every 100 cancers out there, 10 of them are World Trade Center firefighting related. The other 90 are general population related, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Other ways of looking at this statistically give you an even larger number. And depending how we sort the data, we could say that there isn't a 10% increase, that there's as much as a 21 or even 32% increase, which would mean that for every 100 cancers that we get, 32 are related to firefighting in World Trade Center, and 68 are related to just being part of the general population. And there are some specific cancers that even though we only had 10,000 people, so our power was small, there are some specific cancers that are incredibly worrisome, that are increased, and that align themselves very well with the NIOSH study. All right? Melanoma, prostate, thyroid, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. All right? We didn't have nearly as many patients as we needed to look at multiple myeloma, but multiple myeloma was coming out in other ways as a potential positive cancer as well. So what are we doing going forward? We are linking up with these 3 cities. We're going to expand their cohort for the new people as well. We're going to look at other diseases. We're going to continue updating our cancer numbers every 5 years, which I'll show you in a moment. We're also looking at early diagnosis, using biomarker precursor studies to identify cancer early, using low-dose chest CT screening methods to identify lung cancer, colonoscopy to identify colon cancer, PSAs, mammograms, etc. Because the only way to treat cancer, now that we've shown that cancer is increased, the only way to treat it is to get the early diagnosis. So this is our first update from that study. This brings us to 2011. Of course, it's 2018 now, so we have another 5 and more years to keep adding. These are the numbers, but more importantly is this study, this figure, which shows above the axis here, it's hard to point here, but it shows, hard to point, but everything above the number 1 on the y-axis to the left, all right, is a significant increase. And you can see substantial increases in thyroid cancer, in colon cancer, in hematologic malignancies, and in prostate cancer. This is now adding all of our data up to 2011, and unreported 2018 even makes this worse. Now, what you also see is less in the FDNY World Trade Center cohort, less lung cancer than you would expect from the general population. So thyroid cancer is increased. It's increased almost 4-fold higher, almost 4 times higher than you'd expect in the general population. All right. Hematologic malignancies, melanoma and prostate are increased as well, but not by such dramatic numbers. But lung cancer is decreased by nearly 50%. Now, why am I showing that to you? The NIOSH study said lung cancer was increased. But in our FDNY, World Trade Center Health Program, we see that it's decreased. The NIOSH study ended in 2009. The FDNY study on this slide goes to 2009, but we even have data that I just showed you to 2011 and forward. This is not to say we don't have lung cancer. We have many lung cancers. It's to say that it's not increased compared to the general population. It's still covered by the World Trade Center Health Program because of the bioplausibility. But why is it decreased? The reason we think it's decreased is because of the IAFF Wellness Fitness Initiative. Because in 1996, we made a commitment to reduce tobacco smoking, all right? To try and wipe out tobacco smoking. Right? And what we did was we decreased tobacco use in our firefighters from about 19% to less than 6% over this time period. And we continue to fight that battle. But it's our lower than expected tobacco smoking rates that we believe is responsible for this, and it emphasizes that, yes, we want to get rid of the 10, 20, 30 cancers out of every 100 that may be fire and World Trade Center or just fire-related, but we also want to get rid of the 70 that are not. And that is by getting rid of smoking, by doing colonoscopies, by doing the screening that is necessary so that we can deal with reducing cancers and then diagnosing and treating and preventing them. And one of our ways of doing that is with cutting-edge, scientifically accepted mechanisms, such as a biomarker for multiple myeloma, which is called MGUS. MGUS is not an experimental biomarker, it's an accepted biomarker, so we know what it means and we know what to do with it. It's in the blood, it's in blood many years before you develop multiple myeloma. And what you can see here down at the bottom, I direct you to the very bottom of the slide where it says age standardized, and you can see that FDNY has a higher rate of MGUS than the general population. FDNY, World Trade Center Health Program, has demonstrated this. We are now going to reach out to all of these people with MGUS, all right, and get them into an early treatment and screening program to make certain that we can try to prevent the multiple myeloma from developing, and if it does, start that treatment early on. This is what it's all about. It's about preventing, it's about early diagnosis, and it's about state-of-the-art treatment without bankrupting our families. It's about giving every one of you hope, all right? Hope to survive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. And that, just all that information about what lies ahead. And knowing that those workers that post 9/11 are getting the coverage, we're looking at that too at the PSOB benefits and looking for future protections for those that, for the cancers that we are suffering from. Long-term cancer studies can provide critical information to help us understand the link between firefighting and cancer, which ultimately leads to the development of the prevention strategies needed to help us reduce the number of brothers and sisters we lose to this horrific disease. Our next speaker is a researcher who focused on longitudinal cancer research. Dr. Jeff Burgess is an associate dean for research and a professor at the University of Arizona College of Public Health. His occupational research projects focus on reducing toxic exposures and preventing injuries among firefighters. He is currently the lead in a project to develop a firefighter cohort group study on carcinogenic exposures and effects. Please welcome Dr. Jeff Burgess.
I'd like to thank the IAFF for this opportunity to speak with you today about the firefighter cancer cohort study. So, as you've already heard, firefighters do have an increased risk of cancer. And as you've already also heard, those cancers are the result of exposures that occurred years ago. That's because of the latency period that Pat was explaining, that's anywhere between 3 and 30 plus years based on the different types of cancers between the exposure and the development of cancer. Therefore, all the studies that you've heard of to date have really been looking at exposures that occurred many years ago. And in addition, the exposures that are occurring now in the workplace are generally going to occur post-retirement in the firefighters as well. What we don't have, with the exception perhaps of some individual cases like the MGUS that David just mentioned, is the understanding about the cellular changes which are intermediate between the exposure and the development of cancer. So understanding those cellular changes is a major focus of the firefighter cancer cohort study, and I'm going to explain to you in this presentation some of the many advantages of knowing that information. So every study that you've heard about today, except for the World Trade Center study, have been retrospective. So for example, the NIAFF study, you're looking at people when the firefighters when they already have cancer. You're not looking at them before they have cancer. So the firefighter cancer cohort study is actually going to start with firefighters, new recruits and incumbent firefighters, generally before they have cancer, and then following them forward over time. The advantage of that is it allows you to look, when we combine this with knowledge about the cellular changes, we can look at the effects of current exposures. Those can be things such as new household materials, the plastics that didn't used to be there, the flame retardants which change over time, and also those unique exposures. Now, not every place is going to have obviously a World Trade Center event, thankfully, but many fire departments have that very large chemical fire. What are the risks of those individual unique exposures? We can also look at that. So knowledge about the cellular changes also allows you to look at the effect of toxic exposures well before the development of cancer. So you can look at them, you don't have to wait 3 to 30 plus years to be able to determine whether a particular exposure is dangerous. In addition, just as David was mentioning with their addition to the 3-city study, we can look at other health effects. For example, reproductive toxicity. We have very little information on that in the fire service. So a prospective study can look at other exposures as well. Most importantly, this will allow us, again, prospective study, looking at the cellular changes to determine the effectiveness of new interventions like contamination control, like diet and exercise, to see whether they're actually reducing the risk of cancer, activation of cancer pathways, these cellular changes. And then where we really want to get to is to identify which of those cellular changes are reversible so that we can treat those firefighters prior to the development of cancer. So my good friend and colleague, Lieutenant Charlie Popp with Boston Fire Department, likes to call the firefighter cancer cohort study a Framingham study for firefighter cancer. And that really resonates with me because there are a number of similarities. First, the Framingham study is a prospective study just like the firefighter cancer cohort study. It started many years ago in Framingham, Massachusetts, and at that time we knew very little about what things caused cardiovascular disease and what treatments were effective. So, starting in 1948 through now, we've learned many of the things we know about the associations between cardiovascular disease and diet and exercise, and also the effect of common treatments such as aspirin. We hope with the firefighter cancer cohort study to make the same type of groundbreaking research and discoveries that will help us to address the firefighter cancer epidemic. So there are some other immediate benefits from this type of study. So as I mentioned, we know very little about the cellular changes that occur, and those cellular mechanisms are critical to improving the cancer claim process for firefighters. So specifically, I was actually present in IARC, and you're going to hear about this later today from Alex Forrest, when IARC reviewed firefighting and cancer. And one of the reasons that they only rated firefighting as possibly carcinogenic to humans was the lack of mechanistic data, lack of information on what those cellular changes were or are. And I believe that with the additional information from the type of cohort studies that have occurred since then and continue to occur, coupled with the mechanistic information, that we should be able to get to at least probably carcinogenic to humans or carcinogenic to humans, and that will help tremendously with both presumptive legislation in general and I believe with individual cancer claims. So we're currently in the framework stage of the firefighter cancer cohort study. It's supported by FEMA, and we have an incredible partnership among fire service, organizations such as the IAFF and others, fire departments, and academic institutions. So roughly, I'll go into each of these pieces in a little bit more detail. It's structured with a Fire Service Oversight and Planning Board to make sure that we're going down the right direction. We have a data coordinating center where we have uniform information we're collecting from all the fire departments that are participating. We have an exposure assessment center, a biomarker analysis center, and a number of fire service regional partners. So we're going to be taking pre-existing studies in Arizona and in the state of Florida and bringing that on with additional fire departments. Excuse me, we'll be starting with Boston and Indianapolis, and then growing it further. We hope to get to at least 10,000 firefighters or more to have the type of power that we need to answer the questions. So the Oversight and Planning Board is led by Casey Grant, who I believe a number of you know, who's the executive director of the Fire Protection Research Foundation. And the purpose of the OPB is to provide oversight for the study and to help us also communicate effectively with the fire service and develop a long-term funding plan, because we need this study to go for 30 years or more to get its maximum benefit, although we'll see a number of benefits almost immediately, and I'll share some of those with you. So the Data Coordinating Center is run out of the University of Miami. The lead is Dr. Alberto Caban Martinez, and their aim is to create the harmonized data collection system and data collection protocols. So as soon as we there we go. So as soon as we get IRB approval from the University of Miami, maybe somebody from the University of Miami shut that down right there, but we will be starting with the online consenting process, and this will involve an annual cancer risk survey filled out by the firefighters that allows us, again, to link data between the exposures, the biomarkers, and the health survey information, and this is easily expandable to multiple fire departments. The Exposure Assessment Center is led by Dr. Kenny Fint from NIOSH. You'll hear him later today. And the point of the Exposure Assessment Center is to establish the data collection systems on exposures, which is often the weakness of the retrospective studies, as you've heard. Going prospectively allows us to collect very good exposure information. We have already been partnering with the IAFF to make sure that we have self-reported exposure information as part of the in-force system. That's currently being beta tested. We have a similar system in Florida where we're making sure it's the same questions, and we're going to validate that those questions are important in terms of determining what the individual exposure is to firefighters. We also believe that the in-force system in general, or equivalent such as the PER in Florida, will help firefighters with their claims should they unfortunately develop an illness such as cancer. So I'm the lead of the Biomarker Analysis Center as well as the principal investigator for the overall framework study. But realize again that this is multiple institutions and organizations. So it is truly a team effort. The aim of the Biomarker Analysis Center is to identify those cellular effects. And the way we do that is collecting blood. And we often try to get new recruits before they've even had any live fire experience, but we also are looking at incumbent firefighters as well. And then we collect blood every 2 years thereafter. And it's the option of the fire department, should they choose to do this, to also collect baseline and post-exposure urines. And I'll get to that in a moment. So while we can look at a number of cellular changes, the ones we're going to look at initially are epigenetic changes. Epigenetic changes are changes in gene expression without changes in DNA sequence. I like to think of epigenetic changes as the switches that turn on and off gene expression. They are essential in almost all cancers. And the two that we're starting with are gene methylation and microRNA. So, for example, DNA hypermethylation silences tumor suppressor genes, putting you at increased risk of cancer. And microRNAs can either be tumor suppressors, which is good, or oncogenes, which promote cancer, which is bad. So I have just some results to show you today. This is a partial list of our microRNA results. This is based on a previous study that we're working with Tucson Fire to validate these cellular change markers. We compared incumbent firefighters to new recruits. We adjusted for age, which was different, obesity, and ethnicity. And we found 9 microRNAs that were at least 1.5-fold up or down in the incumbent firefighters as compared to the new recruits. And of those, 8 were associated with cancer. And unfortunately, although it's consistent with the reports we have from the epidemiologic studies, in every case where one of the microRNAs was a tumor suppressor, it went down in incumbent firefighters. So that increased their risk of cancer. And in every case where there was a microRNA that was an oncogene, so pro-cancer, it went up in the incumbent firefighters. And if you look at the very bottom line here, that microRNA 4886-3P, you'll see that it was up over 3-fold in incumbent firefighters. And we know, based on studies in the general population, that that particular microRNA is associated with colorectal cancer, which is up quite a bit in firefighters. So I mentioned, too, that fire departments can choose to collect urine to look at immediate exposures. So, for example, we've been doing work with the Tucson Fire Department using the urine to look at concentrations of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which contain a number of carcinogens and are always present in a fire. And by looking at concentrations of these chemicals in the urine, we can look at exposures both from inhalation and dermal exposure, and you'll hear a lot more about that later today. But it sums the two together. And I apologize for the very small lettering at the bottom. I realize you guys can't look at that. But just realize that every one of those blue, the dots in the blue, are baseline before the fire, and all the dots in the red are after the fire. And suffice it to say that whichever population we're really looking at in Tucson Fire, there's an increase in these chemicals after the fire. So you would expect, for example, this to occur in the entry teams, the firefighter entry teams, and it does. But what we discovered by doing this analysis is there was an equally large increase in the engineers that were operating the vehicles. So they weren't getting exposures from going in, they were getting exposures likely from the smoke coming off the fire that maybe changed direction after they parked. So based on this information, they put a number of exposure interventions in place. So this is just a partial list, but they're putting all their engineers on air. And because we're partnering with the fire service and we're looking at the questions they care about, they've been able to convince the engineers to do this. There's been very little resistance. It's not the academics going in and telling them, it's the firefighters, based on the data that we have, showing what the risk is. So they're putting these interventions in place. They're also doing wash down before bagging the gear to minimize secondary contamination. And the fire cause investigators, where we have less information but still showing an increase after a fire, they're putting them in air packs and Tyvek suits. So we're currently collecting more urine to see whether these interventions are effective in reducing exposures. So we can look at a number of other things, as I mentioned too, with this study, and we're already putting grant proposals in place to evaluate these. One is to look at the effects of persistent chemical contaminants. One group are these perfluorinated compounds, or PFCs, you may have heard of. They're used in a wide range of products. Unfortunately, they're also in firefighter foams. And this picture here is not snow. This is actually foam that spilled out of, firefighting foam that spilled out of an airport hangar in California. And previously, in another study a long time ago, we found that 2 particular PFCs, PFOA and PFNA, when you looked at it in the blood, were associated with decreased lung volume in firefighters. We believe that they have additional toxic effects, but by measuring these in the firefighter cancer cohort study, we can actually look to see whether they activate epigenetic pathways associated with cancer. And so again, we're putting in a proposal to study that. Another area that's extremely important, as you've already heard, is that of cancer screening. So we'll talk just about colorectal cancer. So all cancers are different. But for colorectal cancer specifically, based on the NIOSH study, one you've heard about already, a fantastic study, there was a 31% increase in mortality and a 28% in first cancer incidence in firefighters compared to the general population. So quite an increase. But unfortunately, only about 40% of the firefighters who are supposed to get colorectal cancer screening, colonoscopy, or another technique are getting it. So you have a potentially life-saving intervention that is not being done with the fire service. So just what we would call a low-hanging fruit is to do studies to see if we can increase that screening rate to save firefighters' lives. So that's one thing we're doing, again, with other people, a large group of investigators. Another one is to look at some of those microRNAs, which I already showed to you. Some of those actually predict polyps and cancer in the general population. If they do in firefighters as well, and we're putting in a proposal to study this, then we can identify firefighters at increased risk of colorectal cancer, and then they can get screening early, again, potentially life-saving. So that picture is of a polyp, and essentially, well, I would say all cancers, colorectal cancers, start in those polyps, and the idea is you remove them before they can become cancerous. That's the basic idea. All right, so I'll finish up just with talking about the next steps. So we're in the framework stage. As soon as we get the IRB approval, which should be any day now, we're going to start to enroll fire departments, starting with Boston. They were in our initial proposal. Indianapolis has already decided to join us. We have a number of other fire departments that are interested too. So we will be also converting over the firefighters who've been in our previous studies in Arizona and in Florida to be part of this study. We hope to get, as I said, at least 10,000 firefighters or more. We've had a number of fire departments that are interested in helping us during this interim period before we can get additional funding that will help to support this themselves. So they'll help to collect and process the samples and send them to us. We're also putting together a FEMA study under the direction of the University of Miami to expand this and also look at other populations such as the firefighters that are doing wildland and WUI. And of course, in academia, what we do is we apply for grants all the time, and so we'll continue to do that to make sure that we can get the maximum benefit of this study, again, up to 30 years or more. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for all that you do for us. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you. I appreciate that. You can get that to him there, too. Jeff, thank you very much. I mean, I think that study is the most exciting study we've got going for years to come. But I just really want to tell everybody here in the room, you know, that was possible by FEMA grants, DHS, AFG. And I can tell you that we worked tirelessly back at the IAFF, our grants department and our legislative and political department to make sure that that funding is there. It's so important, and we have to keep that there. And we make sure that we are upfront on that and keeping that funding stream alive. Our final speaker in this segment is no stranger to our members in Florida. Dr. Erin Kobitz is a Senior Associate Dean at the University of Miami Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center. More importantly, she is the Director and Principal Investigator of the Firefighter Cancer Initiative. This initiative studies firefighters' exposure to carcinogens, their risk for developing cancer, and the methods of education for prevention, screening, and early detection, along with multiple research projects. Since taking on this initiative, Dr. Kobitz has been passionate on educating firefighters throughout the state of Florida to further understand and reduce the risk firefighters face each shift. Please welcome Dr. Erin Kobitz.
Good morning, everyone. It is my privilege to be here with the IAFF. I am Erin Kobitz, and for the past 3.5 years, I have been engaged in an initiative called the Firefighter Cancer Initiative. I am representing the voice and lived experience of many firefighters across the state, some of whom are in the room today. This work that I'm about to tell you about is not just my work, it's our work. We have done research together, developed educational programs and new technologies that we hope will expand beyond the boundaries of Florida to keep all of you safe. So before I start, where are my Florida Health and Safety Collaborative people? Stand up. this is their work, and these are my heroes. And not represented here today, but always with me, sitting on the shoulders, are the wings of our friend Butch Smith, who passed away from multiple myeloma and inspires much of the movement that I'm about to tell you about. So many of my colleagues have already told you very eloquently that there's an increased risk of cancer among firefighters. And one of the challenges of taking this evidence and moving towards presumption is something called the lack of a consolidated firefighter cancer registry. So what do I mean? Anybody who has cancer has their information reported to their state incident cancer registry. It's anonymized, but anybody who has cancer is tracked from the time of diagnosis to death. And that helps us survey cancer within the population at large and understand emerging trends about new disease or risk of mortality. So one of the first things that we've tried to accomplish in the state of Florida, and I'm happy to tell you, is that we created the first state firefighter cancer registry. And what this allows us to do is to identify firefighters within our cancer incidence registry who have been diagnosed with disease. What happens is when most data is shared with the registry, information about occupation is not consistently recorded. Or, as Dr. Burgess implied, many firefighters develop cancer after they've retired. So if you're diagnosed with cancer 2 days after you retired, the information shared with your state cancer registry is that you're retired. And we miss the opportunity to truly capture the risk of cancer among firefighters. So this has been a huge success for us. I'm going to share some of our preliminary data through the linkage that's been afforded by this new legislation, which helps us substantiate that there is an increased risk of cancer among firefighters living in Florida. Now, this data isn't significantly different from what you've been shown before, but what's telling for us is that when the last linkage happened many years ago, we have started to see an increase in new cancer sites among firefighters. And more importantly, that in sites where we already knew there was elevated risk of disease, we're seeing an increase in the baseline rate of firefighters that's been reported in peer-reviewed literature. So that gives us pause as scientists and as firefighters to really ask telling questions about what is happening and what we can do. We are now moving to conduct a meta-analysis. We're hoping with an additional year of funding from our state legislature that we will be poised to do this kind of work, which will help account for all of the new data that has been collected and presented across many studies to further provide evidence for the types of cancers that firefighters are at increased risk of developing and dying from. All of the work that we do is organized using this framework. This is the socio-ecological framework, and I know that sounds super academic, but what I want you to draw from this slide is that we don't perceive that firefighters exist in a vacuum. Firefighters exist in organizations, they exist in communities, they exist in spheres that are influenced by public and social policy, and our work cuts across all of these realms of influence. And what I'm going to tell you is a little bit of the story of the work that we've done on each of these levels, and hopefully invite your participation into what we're trying to accomplish. We've had tremendous, tremendous support from Florida firefighters, and many of these opportunities are not Florida specific and are open to any of you who are hoping to benefit from involvement. So we do a lot of lab-based research. We actually have, I believe, the first firefighter mouse colony where we have mice that we are exposing to known carcinogens and other substances that firefighters encounter in the field. And that's giving us clear evidence for the etiologic process by which cancers develop in firefighters. More interestingly, we just conducted a series of analyses looking at differences in firefighters who have high exposures to carcinogens and firefighters who have low exposures to carcinogens. And we developed those demarcations using data that was shared to us by the firefighters. What we found when we looked at those differences is that we saw key epigenetic changes in known genes that are associated with cancer, and that the difference between firefighters with high exposures versus low exposures was statistically significant. Now, why do epigenetic changes matter? That's a big word, and it's talking about change that occurs in genes. Well, genes influence cell function, and epigenetic changes happen as a function of environmental exposure. So it starts to give us the biologic pathways to hunt down so that we can understand which particular exposures are driving risk and then look for those signatures in tumors themselves. One of the things that we've done in Florida, and it's not necessarily state-specific, is we have a firefighter tumor bank. So we are collecting tumors from firefighters diagnosed with disease from across the state of Florida, and we're banking them so that we are poised to ask really novel research questions about exposure and outcome. And more importantly, what we hope to glean from this research are new therapeutic targets that allow us to more effectively treat firefighters with cancer. Many of the firefighter cancers that we see in Florida occur in younger individuals, and it's an earlier onset that's much more aggressive in scope. And so we need to come up with new therapies, and more importantly, we need to come up with new prevention. We have done a lot of work with the turnout gear, and what you see here is a study that we are doing to try to understand for how long the turnout gear was eliminating or off-gassing known carcinogens. We're also very interested in developing wearable technology. So we've done a pretty extensive literature search, mostly through the help of our firefighter colleagues, which has shown that there's very few opportunities where the gear itself can have sensors and technology integrated into them that allow us to monitor and quantify the amount of carcinogenic exposures that are happening in the field. And so we are working to develop this, and we actually have a prototype that we're about to take into the field in the next 6 to 9 months that might allow us to advance understanding of the amount of exposure that's happening to firefighters on each individual call and then also over the life course. Sorry. Okay, so one of the things that we also did in this same vein was we developed wristbands, silicone wristbands. Some of you are probably wearing them in the room. I know for certain Sam Eden is. These are the Livestrong wristbands that were popularized by Lance Armstrong when he was in fact still popular. And these wristbands, before we know he doped, but these silicone wristbands can be worn by firefighters into a call. And we can extract PAHs, known carcinogens, and quantify them in a way that we can then also measure those same exposures in blood and urine. And I think this is one of the most exciting things that we are doing right now. These bracelets are super cheap. The technology to process them is super cheap. And once we can validate them in relation to key biomarkers on firefighters who are wearing them, it's really going to advance our ability to collect important data that informs our understanding of what's happening in the field. Most medical records do not include information about your exposures across the life course. And we really need to understand that to start figuring out how to prevent and better detect cancer. Here you see some very fancy scientific artwork that shows the level of PAHs that were detected from bracelets that were worn by firefighters. And what we see here is that the amount of PAH exposure from one fire is 30 times higher than what is recommended by OSHA. We also recognize that the fire stations in which people work in their departments influence practice and certainly influence behaviors related to cancer screening. So we did a very large survey with firefighter leadership throughout the state of Florida, focusing on key organizational domains that may influence cancer screening and decon behaviors. And what we found was really interesting. The scientists at the university and some of our firefighter colleagues were convinced that smaller, more rural departments were going to be less likely to engage in cancer screening. And that's not actually what we found. It has nothing to do with the size or the location of the department. It has to do with the number of the safety and health officers with a given department, and more importantly, whether or not there are written policies and practices in place to promote health and cancer prevention. And so now we are working with the State Fire Marshal's Office throughout the state of Florida to actualize this information. I should have said from the get-go that the State Fire Marshal's Office is our biggest partner in all of these initiatives, and we work hand in hand to try to ensure that the research that we develop leads to action. It's not enough for me as a scientist to publish in high-impact journals. I have to take the knowledge to benefit firefighters, and that's what we're doing through our partnership with the State Fire Marshal's Office. Okay.
So this is
Now I'm showing you a video.
super invisible powder that's used actually for theft detection and cash. But one of the things we're trying to simulate is pretending that this is black soot, just the same type of soot that comes off combustible and burning materials you would encounter in a fire incident response. The initiative actually came to us from the Palm Beach County Fire Rescue Department. They were very interested in understanding about how what they did for work was impacting their health, specifically how maybe being a firefighter or an EMS responder may increase their risk for cancer. One of the things we were trying to do today is figure out, is there a way we can demonstrate how maybe cancerous materials are transferred from a fire incident response back to the fire station and personal vehicle. And so today was really a teaching exercise and a scientific exercise of trying to see how we demonstrate where soot, represented by this invisible dye, might be transferring from when they go to respond to a fire and come back to the fire station. So the goal today was trying to be able to identify, can we feasibly show how soot is transferred from a fire incident response back to their truck and back to the fire station. As you start going through the different scenarios of post-decon into the fire engine, back into the bunk, into the restrooms, back here to the coffee table, it starts becoming less visible to the naked eye. But that powder that is invisible over chronic exposure could be potentially causing cellular changes that we just don't know about yet. And hopefully through some of our studies we can start identifying those changes. It was really an eye-opening experience for us because I anticipated, some demonstration of how much dye would transfer. I didn't realize the breadth and scope of how much dye would spread within the different scenarios that we were shooting in, as well as continue to transfer on after the first fire engine truck. So for me, it was very impressive to see even some of the invisible dye transfer onto the bunks where they're sleeping at night. Even if it's a smaller quantity, you could imagine that low-dose chronic exposure of this dye might be potentially increasing the risk over time. We filmed today in the EMS's personal vehicle. You could easily see even fainter wisps of plume of dye on the ceiling as well as on the seat that were not direct contacts, but were physically visible on this, suggesting that the particulate moves around. So you might not visibly see soot, and in this case we got to see a dye, but that could potentially be increasing your cancer risk. The firefighter works as a fomite and is transferring, carcinogen from where their place of work back to their personal home. So we had an opportunity to have a child with us today to be able to demonstrate maybe what happens in passing some of that soot using a soccer ball. So we were able to have a child play with one of the EMS firefighters with that soccer ball, and we were able to see a second-degree transfer of this invisible dye, i.e. the soot, transfer from the EMS to the soccer ball and to the child. One of the activities that I hope arises from this video that we're producing is that firefighters are a little bit more cognizant about how hygiene is a very important aspect, and decontamination is an important aspect of post-incident fire response, because it makes them a little bit more aware of not only of the soot that they bring back into the fire station, but also what they might be taking to their personal homes and sharing with their families through secondary and tertiary contact of this soot on their own person. And I hope that the firefighters see that as a way of creating an opportunity for awareness and discussion of how we improve hygiene and decontamination within the fire service.
That video is really powerful and very eye-opening. And I think for a lot of firefighters that I've met in my journey, that video convinces them that it's time to start having a conversation about cancer. And if the conversation has already started, to start really moving to strategies and techniques to reduce exposure on the job and in the home. I wasn't planning to talk about this, but yesterday one of my colleagues who is an expert in osteosarcoma treated a little girl whose father was a firefighter. And he said, all I could think about was that video and the dye. Should I show it? I said, no, I don't think you should show it. I don't think that's gonna help. But what we are trying to accomplish in the work that we're doing in Florida is to really move the dial on prevention and risk reduction. And so I leave you with the story of two other things that we are accomplishing that we look to you for collaboration and participation. One, we have developed a train the trainer manual that will be provided to all of our safe and healthy officers throughout the entire state, and it will also be integrated into the curriculum of all rookies who participate in our state fire college. We want to start the awareness about cancer early in the job so people consider signs, symptoms, and strategies to reduce risk and reduce exposure. And last but not least, with the State Fire Marshal Office, we are about to distribute 6,000 decontamination kits to fire departments throughout the state of Florida. The contents of the kit were developed through our research and then operationalized by our colleagues at the Florida Health and Safety Collaborative, our team FACE. Together, we developed the standard operating protocols that will accompany these decon kits, so fire departments that may not be part of this conversation now not only are aware of the need to join what we're doing, but also how to keep their members safe. And we're really, really excited about that. And certainly the video will be accompanying every one of those decon kits. So if people don't know, they will. Now, last but not least, this is a picture of some of us together at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center. And this is one of my favorite pictures. I have it in my office because it speaks to the possibility of what we can accomplish together. I am a cancer researcher who grew up studying cervical cancer in medically underserved women. And many years ago, I was approached by leadership at Palm Beach County Fire Rescue to join them in an initiative to try to understand why firefighters were developing and dying of cancer. And answering that call has been one of the biggest privileges of my career and also that of the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center. We feel that in working together with our firefighters that we are poised to accomplish something really great where when you invite me back in 5 years, we'll start to see some real shifts in the trend of cancer among firefighters. If any of you are interested in accessing that video or other educational materials and videos that we've developed, they are all available at sylvesternewbadgeofhonor.com. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you so much for your collaboration.
Hey, great job. Great job. Thank you, Aaron. That was very powerful. That video, it does. I hope it moves the dial for us. You're doing amazing research. Continue, and we will look forward to continuing working with you. We will now move into our segment that addresses the modern fire environment, how these toxins enter our body, and what we can do to limit exposures. To introduce this segment, I would like to invite Tom Vitras to the stage. Tom is the Integration Director and Business Leader for Globe, one of our sponsors for this summit. He joined MSA 23 years ago, For the last 7 years, Tom has served as the Director of North American First Responder Sales for MSA. Tom also led the recent launch of the MSA G1 SCBA, which is now the #1 selling SCBA in North America. Before Tom comes to the stage, please turn your attention to the video screens.
It was like night and day, the difference between the two, because I was spending a lot of time just trying to balance myself on those, and these, not an issue.
Yeah, I'd agree. It was definitely night and day. The focus was trying to stand up and the other boots versus just walking and doing what you needed to do when you came out. So,
I mean, even comfort. I mean, those kept my feet warm and they were flexible. These are already getting cold and like rigid and stiff.
Mm-hmm.
So we're able to get around a lot easier with these, and like you were walking normal instead of trying to, keep your feet on the ice, and you feel like with the other ones you can come out right underneath you.
I was able to focus on doing my job instead of trying to worry about am I going to fall. I was safe with the glow boot, and I didn't need to worry about it where I had to focus on other things with the other boot. It was a lot harder.
Arctic Grip Pro is the most advanced cold weather gripping system Environment has ever created, and it's really the ideal solution for a firefighter to do his job and do it more effectively and efficiently. When you look at the globe sole itself, you're going to see the Arctic Grip Pro pods, so they're going to have the yellow fleck in it. So that's showing you that's where the actual wet ice technology is located. So surrounding that is what we call our -4 compound. So that's one of our most advanced winter compounds that we have in existence. So the problem with most oil-resistant compounds is that the polymers that are used have a very low glass transition level, so they get very hard as it gets very cold, which become a potential slip issue. With this one, we've tested it to -40, -65F, and it still is very flexible and malleable, which is going to give you much better grip in a variety of different situations.
Good morning. At MSA and Globe, our mission is that men and women may work in safety so that they, their families, and their communities may live in health throughout the world. We're extremely proud to partner with the IAFF and our supplier partners to raise the awareness of the cancer risks faced by firefighters today. At MSA and Globe, we don't just manufacture equipment, we tirelessly pursue emerging technologies and new product development efforts that provide solutions to the challenges faced by firefighters. Many of the partnerships that we've forged over the years have been with government agencies and universities and the research work that they're doing to provide information that benefits firefighters. One of those partnerships is with the Illinois Fire Service Institute and Gavin Horn, and a series of projects that Gavin's been researching that you'll hear more information about in the segments to come. We've also had the luxury of working with Steve Kerber from UL and Kenny Fent from NIOSH, and the work that they're doing to identify the chemicals and threats present in working and training fires, and providing us with information to help answer the difficult questions, such as what are the risks in the materials that can get on turnout gear? What are the off gases produced by the turnout gear? What can happen after multiple uses and launderings to that equipment? Those are difficult questions to answer, but those are the things that we're all working on. This is obviously a new frontier for the fire service, and at Globe, we're very proud to be a part of the efforts being put forth and the dissemination of information to improve the life of firefighters. At the end, our goal is your goal, to provide you with an environment of health throughout your career and well into retirement. So what's encouraging is that the research is being done, the data is being shared, and you're all here to learn and to change. That's what progress looks like. Congratulations to you all, and enjoy the segments to come.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you. Tom, thank you. And I'm sure you told those firefighters to keep their day job. I don't think they're ready for the NHL. Our next presenter has collaborated with the IAFF on many health and safety initiatives. Steve Kerber is the director of Underwriters Laboratory, Firefighter Safety Research Institute. He received his bachelor's and master's degree in fire protection engineering from the University of Maryland. He has led research with fire service in the areas of ventilation, structural collapse, and fire dynamics. Steve and his team have been instrumental in educating the fire service about changing fire environment and transitional tactics through scientific research. Please welcome Steve Kerber.
When your job is trying to explain to firefighters the importance of science, you do things like that to show you that science can be sexy in the fire service, and there's all kinds of things that we can learn from it, and doing all of that research with you has been an unbelievably valuable experience. Click here. So my job is to lead a team that is dedicated to increasing the knowledge of the fire service, figuring out that science, figuring out what you do on a daily basis, and figuring out how we can better understand it so you can be more effective at the job that you need to do every day. Expanding that all the way from tactics, all the way through the problem of cancer and how we understand it and what we can do about it. When we look at the fire service, we really look at it as a big system, trying to understand many of the studies you've heard about, starting with the 1950s and working its way forward. The important thing to understand here is that the firefighter's work environment is not a static thing. What our predecessors responded to over the decades is different than what we're responding to today, which leads to many different hazards. So if you just look at something as simple as a residential house fire, homes are getting larger. Today, a single-family home is 1,000 square feet larger on average than it was in the late 1970s. Open spaces. Something as simple as renovating your house and taking out walls or building houses with open floor plans make more oxygen available to a fire. When you've got more oxygen available to a fire, you're able to burn differently. So when you can burn differently, different products of combustion are created, a different environment exists, and how you interact with that environment is going to be different. Evolving fuel loads, this is a big one, especially for the cancer and exposure problem that we're trying to better understand. The things that were in our homes 50 years ago, when plastic started getting introduced in the 1950s and expanding from there into all different kinds of products, from the natural materials that were there previously, does a number of things. It changes how that fire grows and spreads. It changes what you arrive to. It changes what you interact with. And of course, it changes all of those chemicals that get into the air, into that environment, that ultimately transition to you in many different ways. And we'll talk about that later. Void spaces. Pretty much, if you can design it on a computer, you can build it. So as we look at how fire moves through structures, the increased void spaces change where that fire can go, what it can get into, what it exposes, and ultimately what that means to you. Changing building materials. This one's unlimited, and this is one that we are constantly keeping an eye on, and one that I'm going to show you a number of examples of. But the bottom line is the housing industry is looking for ways to be better, safer, cheaper, all of those things. And I can tell you that their number one thing they're not thinking of as they change those building materials is, what might this mean to the fire service when they respond to this call next week? That's not at the top of the list. But we need to pay attention to that because there's a number of things that we've seen in the past, things like lightweight construction and others, that become serious acute hazards to your work environment. And working with IAFF and folks like Sean DeCrane, we were able to get code changes put in place that can buy you that extra time. So the chance of falling through a floor the moment you go through a front door of a house is a little less today than it has been, even though the construction is changing and working against you. And of course, all kinds of new technologies. This works for us, this works against us across the board, and we've got to be cognizant of all these changes because we're not fighting our grandfather's fire anymore. End of the day, you add all these things up, you begin to look at them and how they interact with each other. One of these might be on the next fire you go to, or all of them might be present on the next fire you go to, but you got to understand what they mean to you and the public that you serve. Ultimately, we're looking at faster fire propagation. What you arrive to is very different than what you arrived to in the past. Shorter times to flashover, which again, changes the combustion, changes the products that are put into that environment. Rapid changes in fire dynamics. When you execute a tactic, the result of that is going to start happening faster. And are we ready for that? Are we coordinated enough so we're ahead of that curve? Shorter escape times. People have less time to get out of their home. You are needed more than ever to make sure that they get out of that home safely. Shorter times to collapse, we talked about with the changing building materials. And then really the one for this summit, new and unknown hazards and exposures. We don't fully understand all of the chemicals out there and all of the impacts they have, let alone burning them. Completely change their chemical makeup. So here's a short video that kind of drives the changes of the evolving fuel load home. In our laboratory in Northbrook, Illinois, we were doing a simple demonstration. We put one room with natural materials, something that you would commonly find 60s, 70s, into the 80s, a cotton-filled sofa, and countered that with something that you would find in every single one of the homes that you respond to today, which are your synthetic fuels, your polyurethane foam-filled sofa, your synthetic carpets, synthetic curtains, everything that you would see today. And I want you to look at this from two lenses. One, what's happening before I get there, from a fire dynamic standpoint. And two, look at the amount of unburned fuel or smoke coming out of that room. And then look at the natural room. White wispy smoke, more complete combustion because we're burning natural materials, but a much slower developing fire. It eventually does get to flashover, but ultimately we're looking at almost 30 minutes before it does. I would bet that today, if you responded to that fire, I would hope you would have deployed hose line in place, water on the fire before that got to flashover. You're not doing that in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. So you're dealing at a different stage in that fire with very different hazards. And some of you would say, well, we've had these upholstered furnishings in our home for 30 years. Foam is not new. Well, it continues to evolve. And here's a perfect example that we came across as we were doing a fire investigation study. During this study, we ordered a number of chairs, thinking that we would get a wood frame, upholstered furniture, polyurethane foam chair that anyone would have in their home. At the end of the test, there was nothing that looked like a chair left. It's like, what's going on here? This also feels pretty light. Well, the frame of this chair was made of polystyrene or styrofoam type material. There was one little piece of wood in the seat, one little piece of wood in the base. All of that chair was styrofoam coated in polyurethane foam. There wasn't a tag on that thing that said that that's what it was, because it's not required. Typically, what the frame of the chair is made of is not required to be on the tag, because it was assumed to be maybe wood or metal springs or whatever the case is. Not today. But it makes perfect sense. You go and order a chair on the internet, and it gets delivered to your house. One of the important costs in that delivery is the weight. So if they can take the weight of the chair down, but still make it structurally sound so you can sit on it and it's comfortable, they're saving money and hopefully passing that savings along to you. In the fire environment, not so much. Evolving building materials. Concrete's not even concrete anymore. Our last set of tests that we were looking at basement fires, we ordered cement board. What showed up on our job site was cement board, but if you cut into it, you quickly saw that it was full of expanded polystyrene. They're trying to make the material lighter. So what does that mean to you? Well, what would be normally off-gassing water vapor is now, as you combust it, is going to be off-gassing the products of combustion of polystyrene, which are very different and a heck of a lot more impact. And I'm no expert in toxicology or industrial hygiene. That's why Kenny's going to follow me and tell you about those things. But it's very different, and there's a lot of different hazards there. The outside of structures went from maybe wood and fiberglass insulation to now foam board and vinyl siding, which again serve many important purposes and are things that you probably want on your home. But when it starts talking about getting these things involved in the fire, especially things like this, where you may be outside the structure doing a 360. No SCBA on yet as you do your 360, you're being exposed to the products of combustion of these different materials that used to be there than 50, 60 years ago. So it's important that we understand the evolution. Spray foam is starting to become very popular as all of these environmental benefits of having an insulated home are extremely important. Except for your work environment, when it starts to get involved in the fire and the game changes. We need to understand how all these things play off of each other, as well as wood. Wood is not wood anymore. So you start talking about natural materials. Well, now it's natural materials bound together by a resin. What's in that resin? Well, in many cases, it could be polyurethane-based, in which case the products of combustion that come off of that are very different than they used to be. Does it mean they're going to go away? No. Does it mean we need to understand what they are and what that means to the hazard that you are faced with and how we protect you properly? Absolutely. Here's an example of a spray foam attic on fire in an experiment that we did. And I show this to you for several reasons. One, the cool fire dynamics and what that might mean to your operation. But two, the products of combustion that come off of this. Look at the color, look at the velocity, look at the density of it. It's not thick black smoke. It's actually kind of a whitish, light gray. You would think that maybe water's on that fire. We had pre-cut a 4x4 hole in that roof, and a 3/4 inch sheet of OSB was holding that hole closed. And this fire created enough pressure to push that and lift that board to get oxygen to burn, and ultimately began to put itself out. No water went on that fire. You're just watching the fire triangle in action right there. But again, very different fire behavior than you would have seen in the past, very different potential result if you wind up in that house hooking that ceiling to provide that fire oxygen, and the resultant exposure and the reading of the smoke that's going to give you those size-up clues to make you understand what level of protection you need and what tactics you're going to use, not the way they used to be. So we start looking at these ideal models. And the reality is, from a fire dynamics perspective, we've been looking at fire growth incorrectly for a long time, especially with the introduction of these synthetic materials into your work environment. The ideal model that's fuel controlled is pretty much replicating what we've been taught for a long time, which is the model of a campfire. So if you took a fuel load, put it out in your backyard, and lit it on fire, you would see fire growth. That fire would eventually get fully developed because it has all the oxygen that it wants to burn, and then it would decay and it would go out. Your reality is that second model right there, which takes into account putting that fuel load in a structure and showing the importance of the oxygen leg of the fire triangle. In this house fire that you go to, as you saw in that video earlier, there is plenty of fuel available, which is able to produce plenty of heat, but there's a limited supply of oxygen. What that does is it changes how that fire burns. It changes the products of combustion, and it changes how it's going to react once you provide that fire oxygen. This ventilation-limited fire is producing all kinds of unburned products of combustion that mean different things to your exposure, and the amount of them is going to change dramatically because you're bottling up what that fire wants to do and potentially burn clean, and you're essentially blocking the chimney and getting incomplete combustion, which is a major hazard. It also means a lot to your tactics. If that fire is looking for oxygen and you give it that oxygen, you better be ready for what the resultant fire dynamics is going to be and choose your tactics appropriately. These products of combustion have also changed dramatically. Again, I'm not going to put chemical formulas up here because I don't know that I understand them all. Again, that's what I have Dr. Fent for. But if you look at this simple comparison right here, what we're looking at is an item on fire. So today, our items on fire are producing a whole lot of incomplete combustion, even when they have oxygen all around them. You go ahead and put that product into a structure, and you get that underventilated fire, you're now looking at the products of combustion that are coming off of a room and contents fire. And now, with all of the combustibles that we have on our structures, you now have a holistic house products of combustion issue where even with oxygen available, look at the amount of soot there. That soot is unburned fuel. That unburned fuel is something that you need to be aware of. It's also full of all kinds of hazardous chemicals that are in the products made of chemicals. They combust, and what that produces, we don't even fully understand. So here's a simple table comparing three things that you're familiar with. Methane, natural gas, burns very clean. So you can see here it produces no CO, no soot, no unburned hydrocarbons. Then we get to something like a natural fuel, red oak. You get a level above that for CO, soot, and unburned hydrocarbons. And then we go to polystyrene. And you're looking at more than a factor of 10 increase in carbon monoxide production, soot production, as well as unburned hydrocarbon production. When you saw the video earlier that had the soot and the particles being transferred and moving throughout your work environment and your life, our studies have seen that for a given particle size, you're looking at more than a 12% or 12-time increase in the number of particles when you burn synthetic fuels versus burning natural fuels. And I challenge you to find a lot of natural fuels in your work environment these days. Everything's being moved to a synthetic component of some sort. So here it is. Here's a quick time of reflection. So if we look at your workplace, if we look at the fires you're going to go to when you leave here and go back to your communities, here's the facts, right? Houses are getting larger. Fuel loads are changing, resulting in ventilation-limited conditions. Home designs are less compartmented, open, more oxygen to burn, able to produce larger fires with larger fuel loads, with energy efficiency being built into them, whether it's house wraps or windows or foam. Evolutions in building materials are changing faster than we can understand them from a research perspective, and much faster than the codes are able to keep up with them. In many cases, we're reactive to things that happen, and we go back and try and catch up to them and change them because they negatively impact your safety. Chemicals are being used that have unknown health implications. And how they change once they burn, in many cases, we don't even know, we don't understand. So how does that impact you? We're trying to figure it out, and we're trying to catch up. A number of acute hazards that can kill you immediately, a number of chronic hazards that can kill you over time. So with these facts, ask yourself, have your staffing, has your training, have your tactics, have your policies and protocols changed to adapt to all of those changes? Think about that. In many cases, it might be yes, and in many cases, you might not even know what these hazards are. But we've got to understand them, we've got to start wrapping our heads around them, and ultimately, we have to evolve because our work environment is evolving. So that's my world. Looking at your workplace, looking at kind of the front end of this complex cancer problem. And like many of the presenters before me, this is where partnerships become extremely important. This is where our knowledge begins to stop. But your questions don't stop there. So the project that I'm going to tell you about right now and introduce with the next two speakers are going to build upon is this partnership led by Dr. Horn at the Illinois Fire Service Institute, bringing in the expertise of NIOSH, University of Illinois at Chicago, Skidmore College, Globe, the funding from the AFG program that is so critical to much of this research to get these answers because it's not cheap and it's not easy. But it takes groups like this. And then the group that kind of sits on top of this is the fire service, because we're not getting any of this done if it's not with the fire service. We're not doing anything for you, we're doing it with you. And representatives from all of your organizations, from many of your departments, are sitting at the table making sure that what comes out of this is relevant to what matters to you. So have a look at this study.
In order to look at the carcinogenic and cardiovascular risks that firefighters are facing, we've designed an experiment in which we asked 36 firefighters to actually come to the Fire Service Institute and do real firefighting in a modern fire environment.
It's one of the first times we're able to bring together the great research that's been done at the Illinois Fire Service Institute, working on the cardiovascular strain of firefighting, with our partners at the Underwriter Labs and NIOSH.
Before firefighters engage in the firefighting activities, we get complete physiological measures. We then put them into the firefighting situation, and we measure all of those things again, the blood, the breath, and the urine, as well as the continuous monitoring of heart rate, EKG, and core temperature. And what this allows us to do is better understand the overall physiological strain, but also to understand how the tactics and what they're doing on fire ground impacts physiology and exposure risk.
So there's a number of components that become important here, right? Looking at how complex firefighting is. There's the fire dynamics component. There's the what you arrive to and how you interact with the component. And then we've got the thermal and cardiovascular strain that your body is going through as you perform your job. And then the resultant chemical exposures that become a part of that are all lumped together into this series of experiments, and we've got experts that tackle each one of those phases to make sure that we're getting the best bang for the buck and learning as much as we possibly can to give you the knowledge you need to hopefully make your job better. So we look at this firefighting and our resultants that we're trying to limit and reduce. Want to put down the cancer, put down the sudden cardiac events. And then we start with, again, your environment, where you work, the products of combustion that get produced, the heat that gets produced. And we start looking at this, as Gavin will put it, from a farm-to-table approach. What's in the materials, in the structure, they will burn. They get released into the environment as toxic gas and particulates. You have dermal exposure. And then on the heat side, you get the heat that's produced by the fire. Then you've got that heat transfers to your PPE. And then it influences your skin and core temperature, all of which are vital components to understanding how it impacts you as the firefighter. None of these components live together. They all feed off of each other. And in many cases, think of as you heat up, how your sweat changes, how chemicals are absorbed into your skin changes. So we've got to look at this as a full system. How your heart works once your core temperature increases, building on all of the great work that Gavin Horn and Denise have been working on for some time, and adding in all of the things of how do we get it from the furniture to the smoke to the firefighter and out in their urine or measure it in their blood to understand those pathways that are so important to protect you to figure out how we limit cancer. We also have the recovery component here as it looks for sudden cardiac events. 2 hours post, 6 hours post, 12 hours post. What is still in your body and what might that mean? What is your core temperature doing and what might that mean to your health? Then we've got the decon piece from a particulate standpoint. How do we control that? How do we do that properly? And then the skin cleaning. How do we get it off? What still goes in? What doesn't make it in? And then all the variables of riding position. Dr. Burgess talked about the pump operator. What about the incident commander? What if you're fire attack versus search? What if you're doing outside ventilation? What if you're on the roof? All of these different exposures mean different things, and we want to study all of those to get you the right information, and of course the tactics. If you go through the front door, if you force the door, if you rent a window, what does all of that mean to your exposure? I can only touch the tip of the iceberg with all of this, and thank God I've got my two colleagues after me to share a lot of the important information. But please care enough to go to these two locations when you get back and send these to your firefighters, because these two websites, ulfirefightersafety.org, as well as the IFSI's toolkit, will give you all of that in-depth information, because your folks are going to have questions, and this will get you those answers. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you. Good job. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. We look forward to continuing working with UL on some great research. You have already heard about some of the extraordinary research conducted by NIOSH regarding cancer among firefighters. The next presenter is one of the most dedicated and talented researchers in the fire service today, helping to make a difference in our battle against cancer. Dr. Kenneth Fent is a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Public Health Service. He joined NIOSH in 2008, where he currently works as a research industrial hygienist. Some of his more notable research at NIOSH has been on assessing dermal and inhalation exposures to combustion byproducts in firefighters. He is currently involved in a comprehensive study of cardiovascular and carcinogenic risk in the modern firefighting environment. Please welcome Dr. Kenny Fent.
Well, good morning. It's truly an honor to be here in front of you today to talk about chemical exposures during firefighting. So this is a chimney sweep from the 1700s. And there are really two things that I want you to take away from chimney sweeps. And that is they tended to be young men, or even boys in some cases. They were of small stature, so they were able to climb up and down these chimneys. They often wore loose clothing. And more importantly for today's discussion, is they have the distinction of being associated with the first case of occupational cancer, where these young men were developing scrotal cancer. The median age of diagnosis was 38 years, but children as young as 8 years old develop scrotal cancer. And researchers believe that the primary cause of their scrotal cancer was their soot exposure, and specifically the PAHs that were in the soot. So fast forward to today and the U.S. firefighter. Now, I sincerely hope that the culture in the fire service is changing, that having a soot-covered body, soot-covered face is no longer a badge of courage. But as you know, that this was relatively common in the fire service. And we've heard today that firefighters have a number of cancers that appear to be elevated. We've already heard this is a lot of review about those cancers. But firefighters are, of course, exposed to hundreds, if not thousands, of different chemicals, including soot and specifically PAHs. So the way that exposure scientists like to look at your exposures is what we call an exposure pathway. And so this is sort of a comprehensive view of how someone can be exposed. And so it considers the source, so where the chemicals come from, where they originate, how they are emitted into the air. If they are present in the air, can they settle on surfaces? Do those surfaces include your protective clothing? Can they penetrate or permeate your protective clothing? Contact the skin? Can they transfer from the clothing to your skin? If they get on your skin, are they absorbed? Do you potentially ingest them when you're eating if they're on your hands? So as you can imagine, this is a rather complex process, especially when we look at firefighters. So if we start out with the source, if you were to ask just somebody in the general public, they would say that firefighters respond to house fires. That's your source of exposure. And of course, that is one source of your exposure. But there are multiple different types of fires. So you can have dumpster fires, you can have vegetation fires or wildfires. You might respond to an industrial fire, sort of, one of these big fires, chemical plants. Car fires, are you near an interstate? If your department's near an interstate, that can be a major source of your exposures. Training fires, if you're an instructor, training fires may constitute the majority of your exposure to combustion byproducts. And so we've heard some of these chemical classes today. You've heard about PAHs, you've heard a little bit about VOCs. And what I want you to know is that whenever you burn anything, any organic material, even a campfire, you're going to produce some of these compounds. So you're going to produce PAHs, VOCs, aldehydes, even acid gases. But as we heard from Steve Kerber, our structures today they're filled with synthetic materials. So now that we have all these synthetic materials inside the structures, you have other combustion products that you have to be concerned about. So for example, phthalates, which is a type of plasticizer. Polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs, which are a class of flame retardants that's largely been phased out because of some of the toxicity concerns. But guess what? It's still in our structures. They'll still be in our structures for decades to come. I imagine many of the seats that you're sitting on right now have PBDEs in them, okay? Dioxins and furans. Dioxins and furans are considered some of the most potently toxic chemicals that can be produced. And if you burn plastics and foams and things like that, you're likely to produce dioxins. Organophosphate flame retardants, which have largely replaced the PBDEs. You may have heard of organophosphates because they're a class of pesticides. And then what most of your trucks and apparatus run on is diesel. And diesel exhaust is also a concern from a health point of view. And you can see in the right column here, we have potential health effects. And these chemicals can produce numerous types of health effects. But as you can see with the bold, that many of them are carcinogenic. So we have an idea of what the source is, the combustion byproducts. And naturally, those are released into the air. And there have been a number of studies that have looked at the concentrations of some of these compounds in the air. So if just thinking about a structure fire, there have been measurements that have looked at these concentrations inside the structure during a fire. Now, I understand firefighters are wearing SCBA for the most part during the attack of the fire. But the concentrations are enormous. And so a good example of this is benzene. Benzene is a known human carcinogen. We and others have measured benzene concentrations in excess of 40 parts per million. To put this into perspective, the NIASH short-term exposure limit for benzene is 1 part per million. That's what you're allowed to be exposed to for a short period of time, 15 minutes or less. So this is 40 times the levels that are allowed. And then we know that there's a lot of smoke, there's a lot of particulate being produced, very small particles that can deposit basically anywhere inside the structure. How about during overhaul? Now the concentrations will certainly diminish over time during overhaul. But we and others have measured concentrations above exposure limits for compounds like PAHs and benzene during overhaul. And really, a lot of this depends on the amount of ventilation and if there's any materials that are still smoldering. What about outside the structure? Well, we've looked at some of the fireground concentrations, so to particulate and VOCs, those can be well above background concentrations. But this also depends on atmospheric conditions. Do you see a lot of ground level smoke, for example? The wind direction, are you upwind or are you downwind? And then one thing that I really want to draw your attention to is that if firefighters are doing outside ventilation very close to the structure, opening up windows, opening up the roof, we've done measurements where we've found IDLH levels of hydrogen cyanide during outside ventilation. And IDLH is the immediately dangerous to life and health level. These are acutely toxic levels of hydrogen cyanide. And then I've got 2 questions here. What about job assignment? How does that affect your exposures? What about tactic? What if you do transitional attack? How does that change your exposures? And these are questions that we're actively trying to address right now with our partnership with the Illinois Fire Service Institute. So obviously, if you have airborne contaminants, there's a potential to inhale them. And it really comes down to, for firefighters anyway, the use of SCBA. And I say, it's really important to wear SCBA in the hot zone in quotation marks, because it's important to look at it as a hazard classification. So, it's not just inside the structure, but also around the structure that we need to be concerned about. Position of command, obviously important, upwind or downwind. And the first bullet point here is that it's important to know that the inhalation route is the most important route. This is the most direct way that these chemicals can enter your body, aside from injecting them. Hopefully nobody's doing that. So it's absolutely critical that we're protecting our airways. The combustion particles are also extremely small particles. They're less than 10 microns. These are considered respirable particles. They're able to penetrate deeply into the lungs. And this is important because particles that can deposit deeply into the lower respiratory system, they can cause inflammation, clearance mechanisms are less effective, and any chemicals on those particles can be absorbed rapidly into the bloodstream. Okay, so you have these chemicals in the air. And as we know, those can then deposit onto surfaces, including the surfaces of your protective clothing. And so a number of studies have looked at the contamination on protective clothing. And compounds like PAHs, phthalates, flame retardants, metals, those have all been measured on turnout gear. And I have a question here. How effective is laundering? This is an active area of research. We'll hear later from Jeff Stahl about some of the work looking at how clean is clean. We looked at hoods, Nomex hoods, and this is a picture of a hood that had been worn for 4 structure fires, and laundered after every fire, and a hood that had not been laundered at all. And what we found is that even though that laundered hood, obviously it looks cleaner, we found residual contamination of certain types of flame retardants in that hood. So this is an important question to answer. Just because we're finding these residual contaminants, doesn't necessarily mean it is a health concern, but it's certainly concerning, and it requires more research. With the study that we had with the Illinois Fire Service Institute, where we had firefighters attack residential fires in a training facility, we looked at the pH contamination on the turnout jackets. And as expected, we saw that with successive fires, there was more contamination on the turnout clothing. But we also looked at the job assignment. And firefighters who did interior attack and search had much higher contamination levels of PAHs on their turnout gear than firefighters who did overhaul. And then that was followed by exterior operations, the command and pump operator. And in fact, for those positions, they were near detection limits. Now, if your gear becomes contaminated, there's also the potential for off-gassing. And one thing that we did that was unique for this study is that we took 6 sets of gear and we put them in an enclosure that was representative in volume to the apparatus cab. And so the idea is these are the concentrations that firefighters could be exposed to during the ride back to the station. And what we found is that a variety of VOCs certainly did increase right after firefighting, just from the off-gassing. The other thing we found is within about 30 minutes, a lot of those VOCs returned to near background levels. And this was regardless of whether gross on-scene decon was done or not. And so this tells us that a lot of these VOCs will just evaporate naturally over time. And this is to be expected as well because VOCs are volatile. They're extremely volatile. That's why they're called volatile organic compounds. However, we might expect something different with semi-volatile compounds. And so that's another area of research that's being undertaken right now. Okay, so if the contaminants deposit on the gear, they may also permeate or penetrate the turnout gear and get on the skin, or they could be transferred to the skin. And so this is also something we looked at in the Illinois study. And so what we found is that, and we primarily looked at PAHs on the hands and the neck, and we found that the hands were more contaminated overall than the neck. And this is sort of different than what we found with some of our earlier studies. But what we had firefighters do in this study is what they would normally do. So firefighters who were doing attack and search were crawling on their hands and knees. They were using water. So a lot of this contamination may be simply because we were looking at realistic fire scenarios. Now, just because we saw more contamination on the hands than the neck doesn't mean that the necks weren't being exposed. And in fact, if you look at the more exposed firefighters, we found levels of PAHs on their neck on par with what we found on the hands. And so what gets onto the skin is important because we know that for PAHs, for example, that those can be absorbed through the skin. We know that if you apply coal tar to skin, about 20 to 56% of the PAHs will be absorbed within about 6 hours. We know that VOCs, which will exist primarily in gas phase or vapor, can be absorbed directly through the skin from air. We know that if you, in a study of monkeys, when they applied benzene to the skin of monkeys, that they were able to detect the benzene in the breath within about 30 minutes, which is about the same time where we see increased levels of benzene in breath. And there are a number of factors that can increase absorption of these compounds, like skin thickness, temperature, sweat, and humidity. And a good example of how skin thickness is important to absorption is looking at the hydrocortisone, the absorption of hydrocortisone by skin thickness. And so if you look at the jaw angle, which is an extension of your neck, it's about 93 times more absorptive than the plantar foot arch, which is some of the thicker part parts of your skin. And we know from some studies that were done, like the FAST study that IAFF commissioned, that the neck will be exposed. And what about ingestion? Any firefighters here, do your hands look like this after a fire response? Are you doing a good job washing your hands before rehab, before eating? If not, there is this potential to also ingest a number of these chemicals. Some other important vehicles of exposure. Excuse my pun, but one vehicle of exposure is your vehicle. So a lot of these contaminants that are on your turnout gear may be able to transfer to your fire apparatus. You may be tracking those back to your fire station. We heard earlier about some of the work looking at the dust in fire stations and how fire stations appear to have higher levels of flame retardants than other occupational settings. What about your hood? What about your helmet? What about your liner of your helmet? What about your tools? What about the hose? All of these can be what we call fomites of chemical exposure. Basically, they carry the exposure and provide a way for you to contact those chemicals. The most important part of the exposure pathway, however, is what actually gets into your body. I could be standing on a pool of chemicals right now, but if it's not actually entering my body, it's not a hazard. So we actually want to look at the dose, what actually gets into your body. And so there have been numerous studies that have found, they've all consistently found, elevated levels of benzene and PAHs in the body of firefighters after firefighting. There's also been some studies that have looked at flame retardants in firefighters' blood and urine, and those appear to be higher than general population levels. And these figures here show some of the measurements we've done looking at benzene in breath. And what we found is that right after firefighting, there are elevated levels of benzene in your breath. And in this particular case, these firefighters were very well protected, wore SCBA the entire time. And so we think that much of the benzene is being absorbed through the skin. Some ongoing research that we've heard about already today, we are looking at flame retardants, what we would call farm to the table or farm to the fork, looking at what's actually in the furnishings, what gets into the air, what gets onto your turnout gear, and then what gets into your body. We're looking at training fires. I mentioned if you're an instructor, that this can constitute a major part of your overall exposure. We want to look at, and we are looking at, particle blocking hoods. Just how effective are those under realistic firefighting conditions? What happens when you repeatedly launder your turnout gear? If you're a progressive fire department, you may be laundering your gear after every fire response. So turnout gear that was once going through a couple launderings per year may be going through 10 launderings per year. How does that affect the protective properties of the turnout gear? We've heard a little bit about the IAFF N4's exposure tracking application. We'll hear more about it today. And one thing that we're doing is we're partnering with IAFF. We're working with the University of Arizona and Miami on the prospective cohort study to really try to evaluate this system and provide quantitative data to validate it. We have the cancer cohort study with University of Arizona and Miami that we're working on. We also, as you've heard about the cancer registry that NIOSH would be leading if that gets support by Congress. And then NIOSH is involved in a wildland firefighter study that's a very comprehensive study looking at multiple different types of health effects as well as exposures. So those are a couple things that are happening now. I just want to acknowledge that this research, I'm sure you can imagine, you've heard a lot about this already today, this requires just an army of researchers. And what's really nice about the folks who are doing this research is that we all know each other. We all get along with each other. We're all sharing this information. In many cases, we're collaborating with each other. And so that makes the data go a lot further. And we can't do this work without the funding from FEMA, from the CDC Foundation, from National Toxicology Program, and others. So I feel like I've presented a lot of bad news. Every time I give this presentation, I feel like I'm a Debbie Downer. But I promise you that there are a number of simple measures that can be taken to reduce your exposures. And Dr. Horn, who's presenting next, will talk about some of those things, some of the data that we've actually gathered to show just how effective some of those measures are. So I thank you for your attention, and I thank you for your service.
Thanks, Kenny. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fent. As always, very informative. This next presentation is a perfect follow-up to the information shared by Steve and Kenny. Dr. Gavin Horn is a lead researcher along with Dr. Fent and Steve Kerber in the comprehensive study that is designed to better understand how operating in a modern fire environment is related to two leading health issues facing firefighters, namely cardiovascular events and chemical exposures related to carcinogenic risk. Gavin serves as the Illinois Fire Service Institute Director of Research. He received his PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Horn's research interests lie in the areas of fire service technology development and firefighter health and safety research. Please welcome Dr. Gavin Horn.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. You guys have been here for about 3 hours. And if you're like me, you might kind of feel like you've just been punched in the gut. Spent 3 hours with speaker after speaker coming through here telling you about some sobering statistics, in some cases some damning statistics in our population. The ever-evolving risk that we face on the fire ground, which is often not evolving for our purpose or for our preference. And the number of risks that we face in terms of how some of these exposures can get into the body and get onto the body and cause some of these changes. Importantly, we're not without recourse. This is one area where, as Kenny just mentioned, a research project that we're conducting at the University of Illinois Fire Service Institute with Steve and with Kenny can help to reduce some of these risks, to understand some simple things that we can put into place that you can do now. Some things require significant investment, and we need to continue to work for those investments so that the organization, labor, and management can work together in order to properly support and to resource and to protect your memberships from each of your locals. But there's also certain things that we can enact right now. This project, again, has been funded through the Department of Homeland Security through Fire Prevention Safety Grants, and I want to thank each of you for advocating for that, as the General President mentioned earlier. These programs come about, they require millions of dollars to fund research like this, but they also impact the fire service around the country and in many ways around the world as a result of the investment that we've made in the fire service together. So I want you to remember the research that we're conducting is not just about understanding what are the risks that we face. That's one important part, and again, it's evolving. We're really just getting to understand that. But critically, we need to understand how we can reduce those risks for your membership, for you. That's an important step. While this research helps to bring home the point why presumption is necessary in the fire service, why those protections are critical and needed, again, as the General President mentioned, what we're trying to do with this research is also reduce the number of people that need those protections. Reduce the number of people on your beautiful walls in Colorado. So we need to be able to have firefighters who are willing to accept some of these risks that come with the job and make some changes that can help reduce those risks. And again, the goal for us is not just to have firefighters who have a long and healthy and effective career in the fire service. We want an equally long and healthy and effective retirement so they can enjoy all the time that they spent protecting the citizens that you're sworn to protect, and they can go on and enjoy the rest of the time with your family after that. In order to do this, we have to accept that there are some risks that we face on the fire ground. Steve and Kenny mentioned these in quite a bit of detail. Typical room and contents fire, you might show up. We could look something like this. We obviously have a header. We obviously have smoke. We have fire. We don the gear as we normally have, but we often think about, when I first got on the job, donning the gear for protection from the thermal environment. Only recently have we started to understand that not only does that gear protect us from the temperature and from the cuts and from the bruises and the SCBA from the smoke so that we can breathe, but it also protects us from some of the long-term exposures that we might have on the fire ground. By the time we begin incident command, lay out that first line, put the pump in gear, this is the conditions we might face. Think about that. Before you even had a chance to don your SCBA, if you're not wearing it coming out of the apparatus cab, some of the initial exposures that we can have just before we enter the job. Obviously, going inside the environment, working in the fire itself, is where we expect to see the highest concentration. Some of the numbers that Kenny showed you were fascinating. The magnitude of the chemical exposure we have in there. We need that protection just so that we can work in there. Without the modern firefighting PPE, the suit, the bunker gear, the SCBA that we have, it would not be physically possible for us to do the job that we're called on to do. We need to remember, though, that when we're in there with that soot and with those particles and those products of combustion, they also come back out with us, because the gear protects us from those chemicals by providing a layer between us and the environment, but that environment then can come back out with us. But that's not where our exposures end. Think about working on an outside vent, where oftentimes we don't have firefighters that are wearing their BA. It's hard even to see the firefighter in this scene. This is a simple room and contents fire for firefighters working in an outside vent condition. Some of the measurements that we've seen in those firefighters are well beyond what we had ever considered before. The amount of exposure we're finding on the neck for firefighters that never even will go into the firefight because of the soot and the smoke we find on the fire ground. And I want to reinforce the point that Kenny made in his presentation. Well, we focus a lot of our research this day and age on the dermal exposures, how these chemicals can get through the skin. The most important thing we need to protect is our airway. On the outside of the structure, many of these chemicals are 10 to 100 times more rapidly taken up into the body through the lungs than they are through the skin. So while we can go a great deal towards protecting our firefighters, worrying about the skin exposure just by enforcing policies, so the firefighters are wearing their BA from the beginning to the end of the firefight, not just when they're setting up, not just when they're on the inside, not just when they're doing outside vent, but as they're removing occupants from those structures who are likely contaminated by those products of combustion, while they're removing the structural contents during overhaul. All of these cases provide us opportunities where we can have airway exposures. One of the most important things that we can do for our membership is to ensure that we wear our SCBA from the beginning to end. Now, there's obviously some challenges this brings out, particularly in overhaul, right? If our firefighters are wearing air during overhaul, we know that increases the weight that they're carrying, increases some of the thermal strain that they're going to face, some of the cardiovascular strain that they're going to face. We need to make sure not only are they wearing the right SCBA, but we have the appropriate manpower on scene to make sure that we can do this safely. So we can rotate members in and out. Some of the research can help you make that argument for why we need to have an appropriate level of manpower, not just for the initial firefight, but for that overhaul and that cleanup process that continues on from here. But what I want to talk most of my presentation on is what we can do about this. Identifying that we are likely to have some level of contamination on the gear. It is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for a firefighter to do the job that has to be done and not have some level of exposure, at least to the gear. We need to figure out how we can get that exposure off of the gear and off the skin as rapidly as possible. And if you look at some of the national media organizations, as well as some of the National Cancer Awareness Organization, Firefighter Cancer Support Network, and others, there's a lot of best practices that exist out there so that we can figure out how we can get from this. Our firefighters that are done with the job, how can we get them cleaned up and get back in service? We know how to put the fire apparatus back in service. We're just trying to understand how to put the firefighter back in service. So how do we take these firefighters and clean them up? A lot of research, or a lot of best practices have been presented for how to do gross on-scene decontamination. The new NFPA 1851 document coming out, this is going to be called a PER. I didn't come up with the word, but Preliminary Exposure Reduction. Same basic concept, basically what we thought of as a decon. So we looked at this in part of our study. There's a lot of different ways you could decontaminate a firefighter, clean them up on scene so that they don't take any of that back with them, or reduce the amount of contamination they take back to the station, into their apparatus, or wherever else they might go. One of the first things that we want to look at is a wet on-scene decontamination, wet soap decon. Rinse down the gear, apply a little light soap product. In this case, we used a commercial off-the-shelf soap product. Figured it worked well for baby ducks and oil spills. It's gentle enough for firefighters. There's a lot of other types of soaps that exist out there, but that's what we used at this point. Something you could buy relatively inexpensively. Want to compare that. Now, a lot of people are saying, I can't do that. I don't want to get the gear wet. It might be cold if you're in Canada, and you say, well, I can't do that when it's 10 below. How effective are some dry decon techniques? Many of these have been proposed. Just using a brush to brush off the contamination from the gear. Or an air-based decon. A lot of different folks have looked at this. In our case, we just took an electric leaf blower, modified it slightly, and tried to blow the contamination off of the gear. You've probably heard one or many of these proposed and some of the best practices that exist out there, right? But they take some level of investment, either in terms of getting the right equipment, getting management to buy in, or even getting maybe your own members of your local to buy into this, the need for this. So as part of our study, we were able to quantify this for the very first time. And the good news is, again, using just commercial off-the-shelf soap, in a paper reported by Kenny Fent, you can find this freely available. I'll give you a link to it at the end of the presentation here. We're able to get about 85% of that contamination off of the gear with a decontamination technique very similar to what you might do in a hazmat incident. 85% of the PAH contamination with a wet soap decon. It's not perfect, but this is a win. This is a huge win for us, the fact that we can have an immediate impact in the amount of contamination that we're going to take back with us, and we might even carry around the fireground with us at that same time. I also want to look at dry decon. And unfortunately, we found the level of contamination we can get off with the brush technique was only about 25%. And on average, we really didn't have much effectiveness with air-based decon technique. This is a baseline. There's a lot of different tools that are being developed from this point, but this shows you the relative effectiveness in terms of what you might need to make an argument to have the investment in time and in personnel and in equipment to do a wet on-scene decontamination technique. This is a good thing for us. We're now working to compare that to how effective is laundering with extractors and other such things. That data is not quite there yet. Ourselves, as well as the group from NFPA, are trying to answer that question. But this is a step in the right direction. This is a win. This is information you can use, scientifically published data in the Journal of Occupational Environmental Hygiene that can be referenced to help you to make this call within your local departments. All right, so that's great. That's how we can clean the outside of the gear. But I also want to look at it another layer deeper. What if we peel that down one more level and look at the firefighter that's underneath that gear? We take off our gear, whether it's going into rehab at the end of the firefight, whatever that is, you'll often see pictures that look like this. Right? Around the jawline where we have some soot deposition, on the hands. You've seen multiple different pictures like these in the past. How do we clean that up? How do we take care of that rapidly? So another thing that's commonly being proposed in these best practice documents are using wipes. We began this study in 2015. At that point, there really weren't any commercially available wipes specific to the fire service. So we just used some commercial off-the-shelf wipes that we found at a local store. And again, in that same paper that Kenny published, what we found was 54% of the contamination can be removed with these skin wipes. 54%. That's over half of the contamination when a firefighter is out getting a bottle change before going into rehab. Immediately on scene, we can reduce the level of contamination on the firefighters by over half. It's important. The dose is not just the magnitude of the contamination on you, but how long it stays on your body. So the quicker we can get this off of the body, the less time it has to transition to be absorbed through the skin, particularly in the area of the neck, which Kenny identified as one that we are very concerned about. Relatively thin skin, relatively high absorption, often warm as a result of the firefight in the hood. 54%. Now, what's the downside to that? Those of you who are math whizzes could figure out very quickly that means about 46% of the soot remains on the firefighter. It doesn't mean that this is not effective, but what that means is we need to make sure that we rapidly get those firefighters who are exposed to heavy levels of contamination, get them back to their station, get them back where they can make a much more thorough cleaning, showering with soap so that they can remove as much contamination as rapidly as possible. Many of you have probably heard the shower within the hour mantra, right? Anyone aware of the science behind that? I personally don't know, but I think it's because it rhymes. That's how it's caught on, right? Don't worry about showering with the hour. Shower as rapidly as you possibly can. As quickly as we can release the firefighters, we can get them cleaned up, get half of the soot off of their necks and their hands as quickly as we can on scene, get them back to the station, and get that shower as rapidly as we possibly can. The idea of the first in, last out firefighter, we need to kind of see if we can pull away from that. That first in firefighter who's heavily exposed, heavily contaminated, we need to get them back and cleaned up and back in service rapidly as we possibly can. Bring in another crew to do overhaul and to do the cleanup and all those other tasks that we have to do to get the apparatus back in service, but get those firefighters back in service as quickly as we can. Now again, this requires a lot of investment, a lot of collaboration between labor and management to make sure that there's an understanding. This is the value of getting those firefighters back out. We're going to need more manpower at the scene in order to make sure that we are protecting our firefighters as rapidly as we possibly can. But showering as quickly as we can is critical for getting as much more of this contamination off as we possibly can. But I want to also take another step back behind this. One of the things I want to look at is what else could we do to even reduce the level of the contamination you see on the neck and on the hands. I'm not talking about changing tactics at this point, not talking about, in many cases, even changing equipment. What are some small process things that we can do? On the hierarchy of controls, one of the first things we should really start looking at, as opposed to getting new equipment, new PPE, is the process in which we don and doff that personal protective equipment. So let's take a step back. Looking at the hands. These are firefighters who had clean hands before they went in, and they came out, you saw all sorts of different levels of contamination on the hands. Actually, they were in a nearly identical environment doing nearly identically the same amount of work. So how is it possible you can have this huge difference in the range of contamination on the hands? And I want you to think about how often you take your gloves off and put your gloves back on the fire ground. And what do you do when you take them off and put them back on? We know that the hands are going to be just as contaminated as the bunker gear, in some cases even more so. Are you walking back to the rig to get the bottle change? Are you walking back to rehab with your gloves on like this? Or with all that contamination was on the outside of your gloves, now on the inside of your hand? We largely contribute this exposure to being put onto the skin during the firefight itself, because we've never really looked at it before. We just put firefighters in that were clean. By the time they came back after rehab, they were dirty. We didn't know how. Now we're starting to look at what happens to get from point A to point B. Well, think about what you do when you take off your gloves. This is pretty simple, right? Firefighter taking off their gloves takes a number of seconds to take those gloves off. Just a few seconds to take those gloves off. Clean hands before, now got contaminated hands afterwards. Can we make a small change in the process of doffing those gloves just to make sure we're not touching the outside of the gloves? It might take another second or so in terms of doffing those gloves. But the difference in the contamination we have on our hand is obvious, just by a very simple change in how we teach our firefighters to take their gloves off. And I'll admit this is not new to us. Many of us work in medical services or have worn nitrile gloves. I've never seen someone take a nitrile glove off any way other than this, being very careful not to touch the outside of those gloves. And we do that because we're trained to do that way from the very first time we put the nitrile gloves on, because we don't want to touch those body substances that are on the outside of that glove. We respect the contamination on the outside of those nitrile EMS gloves. If we could do the same thing with teaching our firefighters how to respect the contamination on the outside of their bunker gear, this isn't going to affect how we fight fires. This isn't going to really be a significant investment. We can have a significant impact on the contamination just that we get at the end of the firefight itself. So this is a picture we posted a few months back that received some significant interest in the fire service. 2 firefighters doing the exact same work in the exact same environment. One on the left took off his own gloves, the one on the right, the gloves were taken off so he didn't touch them. It's the only difference between the contamination on those hands. And again, I want to reinforce another point that Kenny made earlier. The hands are one of the most important vehicles for contamination. Think about that. One of the first things that often comes off, at least in my case, is gloves, right? Take your gloves off. Then when everything else comes off, you got sweat, so you're wiping the sweat off your face. Might have a little snot coming out, so you're getting it into all the mucous membranes, wiping your eyes out. Going to rehab. Anyone been assigned a knife and fork in rehab? Everything's hand food, right? Finger food. And gentlemen, if you paid attention to the presentation that Kenny had, we're really concerned about the absorption of the skin through the neck. Well, remember what the highest absorption was. So next you go to the bathroom after a firefight and you don't wash your hands before using the bathroom, consider where you're going to have the most rapid absorption of any of these contaminants in your hands. Hands are one of the most critical aspects, and if we can just do a small change, take 1 second longer to doff these gloves, we can potentially have a significant impact just by looking at the process. You can find a full video on our YouTube channel here. We've got a 2.5-minute video that kind of discusses this, as well as the next little section I want to talk about, which is the hood. So what about reducing contamination from the hood? This is an area where our PPE manufacturers have done a great job at developing new equipment to reduce the risk for contamination to get onto our neck. Multiple different hoods that have been released the last few years at FDIC. So if we take a look at this, this is what a firefighter might look like when they get done with their activities, starting to doff their gear. And if we have these hoods now, which would allow any soot to come through, instead of having a soot on the neck, all that soot would be sitting on the outside of that hood. This is a good deal, right? If we can keep all that soot from getting through the hood and staying on the outside, we've had a big win. And I commend the PPE manufacturers for going after this with such vigor. But think about what we do next. What's the next step after our helmet is off? Where's that hood going? All that soot and all that contamination, if you do it the way that we typically do, is going right back down around your neck. So we can defeat all of the benefits of this new type of PPE if we don't also look at how we doff the gear. So again, we just put together another quick little video on this, just looking at the process of pulling the hood off. This might not work for everyone. Right? This might not be realistic, but we could start thinking as a fire service of different ways that we can put the gear on and take the gear off. We can maybe start working with manufacturers so that the gear it's just as important so we can get the gear off safely as it is to put the gear on safely and rapidly. If we make a small change now, instead of that coming down around the neck, it goes around. You can even stay on air throughout here and pull the hood off with a mask over the front and instead of coming down the way that we traditionally do. What's the difference in the contamination on the neck? Pretty significant. Now, in this case, we were just using a chalk powder contaminant. We weren't intentionally contaminating poor Richard here. But this is the type of things that we can very quickly look at how contamination gets moved from one part of our gear to the other, very similar to the fluorescent dye study that you've seen in the past. And small changes like this can reduce that cross-contamination. So we can start to understand how much of the contamination comes from the firefight and how much contamination is coming, are we putting on ourselves after our gear has done the job that it is designed to do. Again, this might not work for everyone, but this is something that we suggest you all consider and think about what you can do in your departments to doff the gear in a way that is controllable. Now, this picture probably doesn't require any explanation, right? Most of you have been through this. At Proby School, how many hours, and by the end of the months, how many days do you spend doing donning drills? Getting that gear on as rapidly as you can, covering everything else up as quickly as you can, a minute, 45 seconds, whatever your benchmark is. And as soon as we get all that gear on, what's usually the next step? Just take it off and get it ready for service. Is there a way we can spend just a couple minutes during the doffing to say, hey, why don't we practice taking our gloves off so we don't touch the outside? Maybe we can think about taking these hoods off in a different way so we can spend just a little bit of time thinking about doffing as much as we do with donning the gears. A very small change, something that could have an important impact. So we've covered a lot of material, right? And this is a toolkit that Steve mentioned earlier. I want to just go in a little bit more detail on this with you. This is something that's freely available. We released in December. We want to get the information out there at whatever level you're interested in absorbing it. So on this toolkit, you can find tools ranging from science to translation to teaching. And so what each of those means from the science tool, you want the papers that give you the data and the information behind some of these recommendations, you can find it there. You can download them for free. We've paid a little bit of extra money so that we have the copyright ownership for them. We can put them up there, and you can get that without having to track down through some scientific journal. You want to be able to reference that directly when you're making your arguments to management, to the village, to whatever else that is, they're freely available. Many of you might care a little bit more about the translation. What can I do with this information? And in that case, there's a series of translation tools which you can find. There are documents written by us, written by others, that are being put in a language and in a way that hopefully can be implemented by the fire departments, realizing that everyone has a different reality. We can't tell you how exactly to do this in your fire department, but we can give you some examples of how it's being done in other places. And then some teaching tools. This is a case where we have webinars we've done for FDIC or Envisage that we can link to right here, so you can see with the research scientists translating this research for you, working on an online program which UL does for all of their studies. Hopefully it's going to be available early this year, that release can help you work through that material on your own. If you want to sign it for a 1-hour training some night, it's available for you to freely download from this site. Right now, this information is really here from the Fireground study. We're going to continue to update this with training fire study, with the PPE cleaning study information, to make that available as quickly and as rapidly to you as it possibly can. We are happy to take any questions, insights, any thoughts or questions you might have on this type of work. But before I go, I want to leave you with just a couple more resources. This is the website to get to that toolkit. Steve showed this earlier. We put everything out as rapidly as we can on Facebook and Twitter to engage the fire service when we have our next research study, to get feedback from those, as well as to make sure that we are putting the message out across the fire service, not just as a local research project, as a national research project. So again, as I leave, I want to remind you that this research here is trying to address what are the issues that we have and what are the things that we can do to reduce those risks. So thank you for everything that you do for your hometowns, for the people that you protect, and I hope that this will help you not only have a successful career, but a successful and long retirement. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Gavin, and another thank you to all of our presenters. I think it was a great morning, and thank you for hanging in there. We have an excellent lineup in the afternoon. I think the work that all the presenters are doing will not only help us understand the links between our occupation and cancer, but also help us to develop those prevention strategies that are so important. We still have some great presenters this afternoon, but before we break, I want to thank those that are watching live on our Facebook and different modalities out there that you're looking at. We really appreciate all your comments. We've had a lot of comments of those firefighters that have lost loved ones, family members that have lost loved ones, and we really do appreciate you being with us. So please come back to us. I mean, we're going to start up at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please be back here in the room. We're going to start with legislation, policy, standards to protect firefighters, and culture. So take this time. We have about an hour break. Lunch is being served. And let's get back here promptly at 1 p.m. Thank you.